November the 3rd, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo,
Hey, how are you?
pretty good, yourself?
Oh, can't complain. Full of fried chicken, so an ideal state of affairs in the grand scheme of things.
Oh, he is flying right now, let's go. That's what I'm talking about. Based life enjoyer, I respect it. It's good to enjoy food, I'm glad you're full. I was blessed someone sent me a burrito today. That was nice.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
oh yeah, that's right. They can send you food and stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. You do have to pay for the delivery and whatnot, but it adds like a personal touch of you could take care of someone's food needs for at least a few hours. That's nice.
What kind of burrito was it?
It was like a loaded vegan burrito, I guess is the way I would describe it. A lot of
A
different
loaded
stuff.
vegan burrito.
Yeah,
That sounds very California.
it is very California.
Was it decent?
Yeah, very
All
solid.
right. All right. I'll give him credit for it.
Yeah. So that was good. And Dota's been crushing. I've been keeping notes for myself in a journal so I don't repeat the same mistakes too many times. And I try to figure out the lesson to be learned from me personally instead of just feeling that seductive sense of entitlement of wanting to know that it really was other people's fault, wasn't it? It's hard to it's hard to say no to that voice when it whispers such sweet things to you like they really threw you did a great job, you deserve to win. It's like, no, I also fucked up in at least three ways, and I should just say what they are and move forward.
There you go.
Yeah.
It's good to stay humble. Eyes on the prize.
Yeah. But a pretty good week overall. I did collect some starting topics from chat as we were getting ready to go. Obviously, there's a looming U.S. election. I'm sure people will want to hear something about that. But from chat, as we started, have you heard of Peanut the squirrel?
I saw that on Reddit earlier today.
Okay. Because chat was saying that apparently this squirrel had a bunch of like follows on Instagram, and then someone was jealous or resentful of that, and then wanted to send Peanut away, and then it ended up being euthanized or something because you're not supposed to have those as pets.
Yeah, that was pretty much the gist of it from what I read of it. You know, the squirrel had enemies, Neuro.
How?
I don't know. Somebody didn't like it for one reason or another, and she reported it because apparently the owner of the squirrel in question had not gotten a license. Because apparently you need a license to own a squirrel in New York City, I guess. So he didn't have one, so the police came and seized the squirrel. And I think there was also some kind of biting incident involved at one point. I think that had more to do with the euthanasia. Supposedly it bit like one of the cops when they were taking it. And so apparently in order to test an animal for rabies, you have to kill it first. It has to be dead.
What?
So you can examine the brain. I had never heard that before,
What?
but that's what Reddit was saying today. So supposedly that's why they put it down, so they could test it after it bit one of the officers. I don't know if that's true, but again, this is the story that's making the rounds. So some people are saying that this is an example of like big government killing people's pets and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically just internet drama.
Gotcha.
We'll probably get more details that'll debunk most of it in like a week or two.
But I don't know, because there's so many different people who post videos of animals in their home that are technically wild animals, and you shouldn't have them in your home. So they're basically collecting evidence of them committing a minor crime. Keeping a squirrel without a license, a misdemeanor of some kind.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know why you need to seize the squirrel in that case, though. It seems like you could just I don't know, like throw it out a window and then it runs away, right? It's not like they're unusual here. You don't need to like take it back to the station.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess that's what they did. So make of it what you will. I don't think it's going to impact the election or anything,
How did
if
the
that's
squirrel
what the
get into
question
the
is.
house in the first place?
It had apparently been there for like 7 years or something.
Mm-hmm.
Very long time. And just got in, and the guy who lived there kept it, like as a pet.
He didn't let it out.
No.
Okay. Captured
Yeah, I don't
wild
know the
animal.
exact details. It may be that he went out of his way to like buy a squirrel. I guess that's also possible. Yeah, Reddit was not entirely clear on the details. It rarely is. The whole thing just reeks of Reddit drama to me, so I don't take it overly seriously. I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't read too much into this one.
You don't think this is going to have a major legal bearing on the Supreme Court?
No,
Okay.
no, I don't think the Supreme Court cares.
Well, Peanut the squirrel, God rest him. That's a weird situation. Wish we could have navigated that better. I don't think we need to escalate to violence to test for rabies. That seems like you just yeet an animal and kill it instead of just being like, ooh, that squirrel bit me a little bit. Maybe I get a rabies shot. And I've heard that those hurt a little bit, but it's like hurt your leg somewhat for a rabies shot versus end the creature, which I guess that would be the policy for a dog bite or a squirrel bite or whatever. In any case, Peanut the squirrel was one of the topics mentioned. We also have. Oh, wait, see if Whiskey has some information on the squirrel. He was not able to function outside. He ended up taking the squirrel instead and applied to have it registered. New York paperwork was still pending. Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. So he was attempting to get a squirrel license. That makes his story more sympathetic. That's good that we heard that. Sorry the squirrel didn't make it. That's pretty mean. Okay. I think maybe they should just make an addendum. It had been pending for 7 years? Oh my gosh. Who is the person who approves the heckin' squirrel license? Also, people asked about Koreans in Kursk. I think we touched on that last week.
Yeah, there was some question about where they would go and what they would be doing, and there's more. There's been more reporting over the past week that they are going to be engaging in combat, and it looks like they're going to be deployed to Kursk, which is the region of Russia that Ukraine invaded, a month or two ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems the North Koreans are going to try to help the Russian army contain the Ukrainian advance there. I don't think they're advancing too much these days. I think the offensive in Kursk has slowed down pretty considerably over the past month. So I don't know what there's going to be really for the North Koreans to do. Maybe they'll launch some offensives and try to take some territory back. We'll see. But given the rate of casualties in Ukraine, I don't know that just 10,000, 15,000 North Korean troops are going to be able to move the needle too much. I don't doubt they'll exert some attrition on Ukrainian forces in Kursk, but I don't know that they'll be enough in and of themselves to be the decisive factor in the Battle of Kursk here. But yeah, other than that, not really any new developments. I don't think they've actually started fighting yet. At
How
least I
would the
haven't read anything
communication be
about
done
it.
between the North Korean officers in that contingent with the Russian forces there? Would they speak in Russian to each other?
Probably. I would assume that the officers are going to be relatively well educated and that they'll probably have picked out officers for the expeditionary force that are familiar, at least,
That would make
with the
sense.
Russian language, so that there can be, so that they can preclude any issues with communication between Russian commanders and Korean officers.
Makes sense. 10,000 is a lot of people, but in the scale of Russian military and Ukrainian military, it's relatively small size.
Yeah, yeah, not too big. and we don't even know just how intense the fighting will get. Just how serious the North Korean formations will be. It could be they're just placeholders meant to hold a defensive posture so that the Ukrainian army can't expand too much further. All speculation. We'll see. It remains to be seen just what the game plan is there.
Chad said there were floods in Spain.
Yeah, some big ones. Done a lot of damage. Yeah, it was like a series of storms that moved through Spain, caused historical flooding, and a lot of people just were not prepared for it. And I think it's several dozen dead now, probably more. And the government is kind of struggling to respond because the scale of the disaster is kind of bigger than they were anticipating. I was reading today that the King of Spain actually went to some areas near Valencia, which were particularly badly hit. And there was like an angry mob that formed around him. They were accusing the government of not doing enough and, insulting him, throwing mud at him. It turned into a thing. And eventually they had to have the king leave. Basically, his security detail told him, we have to get out of here. There's too many angry people here. And they ended up delaying the rest of the trip on that count.
Chat says 217 plus dead.
Oh, higher than I expected. Yeah, there's been more and more dramatic climate-related type stuff like that in Europe.
This isn't like a historical or like a seasonal flood that they have?
No, this was especially bad, basically. There's been flooding before, but nothing to this scale. Kind of caught them off guard a little bit. It's probably not going to make too much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. I don't think after maybe a year or two, it's going to be like the main issue in Spain. It's not going to do anything good for the government's popularity, but I think the socialist government in power right now has managed to survive, pretty much everything that's been thrown at it for the past couple of years. So I don't know that this will be anything different. People will complain, but then otherwise things won't change too much. Yeah, Prime Minister Sanchez has been around a while. He's got a lot of perseverance. But he also hasn't really done anything especially impressive from what I've read. It's just kind of hanging around at this point. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer early this week so I don't forget later. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And we do enjoy the feedback we get on here. So, if I'm wrong about Spanish politics here, let me know. But that is my impression. Sanchez is not especially popular, but he's not unpopular enough to really be ejected from power, at least as of yet. Yeah, Spain was one of those countries in Europe that kind of had a revolving door of governments for a while. And then eventually Sanchez got in and he kind of stopped it. But he didn't really stop it by doing anything like impressive, that really solved the country's problems. He was just able to kind of barely manage popular majority in the legislature that was able to keep him in power. But otherwise, not necessarily a lot of policy achievements that I'm aware of. If we have anybody from Spain who knows different, let us know. But as far as I know, that's the case. I remember a while back he was getting in trouble because he was trying to give amnesty to the leaders of the Catalan separatist movement. Do you remember that from back in the day?
That
was one of the first things we did on this segment way back in 2017. Yeah, there's a region of Spain called, I'm probably going to mispronounce it, so I'll just apologize in advance. It's called Catalan. It's in northeastern Spain. Barcelona is the biggest city there. And they've always kind of had more of an independent streak. They also are responsible for a disproportionate share of Spain's economy. And they've had separatist tendencies for a while, but back in 2017, they flared up. They had a pro independence political party basically in charge, and I think specifically of Barcelona. And they tried to hold a referendum on independence that technically passed, but there was also basically a kind of boycott by all of the anti independence folks. So the election looked like a clear win for independence, but in reality, the only people that voted were the people that were pro independence. So it was heavily skewed. So then there was a bunch of drama because the Spanish government kind of cracked down because obviously they weren't going to just give them independence. And things just kind of spiraled out from there. I think the leader of the party in question in Catalan ended up on the run, I think living in like Belgium or something, where he's been pretty much for the past 10 some years. So there was some drama relatively recently where the socialist government tried to give him amnesty because technically the Catalan separatists, they were not banned. They were still, in the legislature. They were actually allies of the Socialist Party, and they were helping them keep and maintain a majority in the parliament. So one of the quids pro quo, basically, that the Catalan folks were demanding in exchange for support was some degree of amnesty for their leaders from the 2017 drama. And so the socialists were kind of okay with that, but then, of course, the conservatives raised a big stink about it. And so it turned into a big shouting fest for a while.
Damn. Yeah, it's ringing a bell with the wanting to make their own state and being one of the more affluent regions. It's one of the things that's, I guess, a favor asked of the wealthy in a region is to help the less wealthy regions nationally, or on a national level, like countries like Germany pulling a lot of weight in the EU, and certain countries benefiting more from being a member in the EU, kind of having that backup. Backup has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, every region, every country has an economic engine in it, generally located disproportionately in one or the other region. And those regions frequently feel a little bit put upon by the fact that so much of their tax money ends up going to other places, outside of their own core region. So that not infrequently leads to tension and what you might call centrifugal forces, generally desire for some degree of political autonomy, greater control over their own resources and tax revenue, that kind of stuff. It's not unusual at all. You can really see that in the European Union, where there's still a lot of desire for Germany in particular, but also other states that are sort of the economic leaders of the European Union, to retain relatively more economic autonomy from the EU as an institution. And then, of course, the poorer states in the Union tend to demand the opposite. They would prefer there to be more money redistributed through the EU so that they could benefit, and so that there could be more of an evening out in the differences between the levels of economic activity in different regions of the EU. Basically just some regions are way behind others, and they would like to catch up, and they want the EU to use redistributive policies to try to help them with that. Which, of course, Germany in particular doesn't like. They're not really gung-ho about that. The sentiment in Germany is that money redistributed like that is just going to end up getting stolen by corrupt kleptocratic elites in places like Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. If not also, other countries in the sort of southern part of the European Union. So yeah, that is a clear-cut divide in the European Union, and you can see very similar types of debates occurring within individual countries in other parts of the world. Generally, it doesn't get so bad that the wealthy region in question wants to declare independence. But if partisanship and political tensions kind of reach a certain threshold, it's not uncommon for that to pipe up, for that to start, for demands like that to emerge kind of spontaneously.
Cool. Someone also asked about Georgia, the country. They had an election recently.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it last time. That was when I went on that long screed about Russian approaches to influencing neighboring states.
Oh.
Yeah, so Georgian Dream is sort of the more pro-Russian party in Georgia. It's run by a billionaire named Ivanishvili, and they've been in power for like 10 years or however long. And in the recent election, the opposition, which had been fairly fractured amongst several political parties, actually managed to successfully negotiate a coalition, a common front that they would run under. And so it seemed like they might actually be able to win the election. But as it happens, the result as of now is that they lost. Not by a big margin, but it was a slim victory for Georgian Dream. However, the opposition is saying that the election was rigged. I don't know exactly what evidence they have for that. I think some of it was that Georgian Dream got a higher portion of the vote than expected in Tbilisi, which is the largest city and capital of Georgia, and that's generally considered like the bastion of opposition support. It tends to be more liberal and international minded than the rest of the country. Also, I think there was an issue with exit polls. You know, the opposition was saying that the exit polls were suggesting an opposition win, but then the final reported result differed significantly, and they suggested that might be evidence. So I'm sure there's other things they brought up since then, but it wasn't entirely clear what they would actually do about any of this. Since what I think over the course of the past week, some of the new developments have included the president declaring that the election was a fraud and asking people to come out and protest against the government. Keep in mind that Georgia has one of those political systems where there's both a prime minister and a president. And the president is elected, but also doesn't really have much political power. Like most of the political power is in the office of the prime minister. So the president is more kind of like the King of England, is more of a symbolic figure. An additional check and balance, but not an especially strong one, institutionally speaking. And generally, over the course of the past 10 years, Georgian Dream has controlled the legislature, but the presidency, which again, very weak position in Georgia's politics, has been controlled by the opposition. And so, you know, in this case, the opposition president, of course, agrees with the protesters, with the opposition, that the election was rigged. And she's coming out and kind of condemning the government and Georgian Dream for allegedly cheating, you know, quote unquote. So there's been some mass protests over the past week correspondingly. But beyond that, I don't think there's any change in the general trajectory of the election. It seems like, whether they cheated or not, it seems like Georgian Dream has won. And unless something dramatic happens, they will probably continue to govern Georgia for the foreseeable future, presumably.
Interesting.
Yeah, I did read a little more about Georgia's attempts to join the European Union. You know, like I said last time, everybody across Georgia's political spectrum says that they want to join the European Union, but at the same time, Georgian Dream has passed some legislation, specifically the NGO legislation, which has basically stalled the process. The European Union said that by passing that law, that, you know, Georgia's laws were not in accordance with the norms of the European Union, and that until they changed them again, that the accession process was going to be put on pause. And Georgian Dream says that it's a sovereign issue for Georgia and that the European Union shouldn't be intervening in Georgian politics by commenting on it, and that if the EU wants to stall accession talks, then that's on them. It's not the fault of the Georgian government. So they say they still want to join the European Union, but they also apparently don't give a shit if the European Union stalls the process. So I suspect they're not as interested in EU membership as they say, which I don't think really would surprise anybody, given how relatively more aligned with Russia that the party is. Interesting times, Neuro.
We live in the silly timeline. It's awesome. I think those were all the topics that I saw in chat so far. So thanks for addressing them.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, the simple ones we can get through pretty quick.
Yeah.
We can kind of blow through those. A lot of stuff that happens that makes headlines is more just continuations of existing trends. And in so much as that's the case, there's generally not a lot you can comment on that. If it's just stuff that was already going on, you're not going to have much more to add. The stuff that really gets conversation is the stuff that's genuinely new, a break with established trend, or a completely new trend that emerges from nothing. That's generally the stuff that requires and begs more analysis. But I don't think anybody is surprised at this point about like Georgia and Georgian Dream. If you've been following Georgia long enough, this is basically just more of the same. It's just kind of the status quo. You could talk about how it links up with Russian influence in the region, but we did that last time. So I'll spare you a repeat. Well, has anybody brought up Cuba?
Not that I saw.
A little surprised. There were a couple people asking about Cuba over the last couple sessions, so I was a little surprised when nobody asked about the big power outage. Have you heard about this?
No. What happened?
Cuba's whole electrical grid failed a week or two ago, and they haven't been able to get it back on.
Damn.
Yeah, there's just been no power. It's pretty bad. It's not as though Cuba's economy was doing great even before the outage, but this really kind of seems to cement the decline, or at least the degree of decline that Cuba has been experiencing economically over the past few years. Because the main reason I've seen cited explaining the power outage has been lack of investment. And that really suggests that there must be some strains in the Cuban budget. Because, electricity is pretty important. That's not really something you want to skimp on as far as maintenance and investment. But it seems the Cuban government has either had to skimp on it or is just so replete with corruption that they effectively had to. Either way, it doesn't reflect well on the Cuban government's ability to manage its resources. Embargo notwithstanding. When was the last time we talked about Pakistan?
Feels like it's been a bit. I think there was a question about Pakistan helping someone else, but I think the most memorable thing was the doctor versus lawyer fight or whatever. That was pretty sick.
You still remember that, huh?
Hell yeah. That was one of the coolest battles. The doctors and the lawyers duking it out fist to fist. They all have PhDs, but they also have fists.
And 2020 was a wild year. Quite the ride. Well, other than doctors fighting lawyers, there's always more drama in Pakistan, but it just hasn't been in the news as much. Basically because the war in Afghanistan ended. So the United States government hasn't been as interested in doing favors for Islamabad as it used to be. So the result is that Pakistan just kind of has been left to its own devices, and unfortunately for them, that's not great news, because Pakistan's elites are pretty self-serving. They don't care all that much about the well-being of Pakistan, and without all the aid money they were getting, they've had to really kind of deal with the consequences of that mismanagement. Yeah, they actually did deal with a power problem, which is to their credit. They were experiencing chronic electricity shortages for a while, maybe around 5 to 10 years ago, but they were able to get a bunch of investment, I think mostly from China, that significantly increased their capacity. So that's at least one problem scratched off their list. However, they still have a lot of other problems, one of which is that Pakistan has been badly affected by global inflation. Pakistan is not like a exporting powerhouse. So when prices started going up around the world, they were not among the exporters that benefited. Quite the opposite. Energy becoming much more expensive had knock-on effects for the rest of the Pakistani economy, because they're definitely not an energy exporter, very much an energy importer. And between that and chronic government deficits, which they seem unable and unwilling to really address, I would point out that, interestingly, the problem with Pakistani debt issues is not that the government necessarily spends too much per se. The bigger problem is that the Pakistani government does not collect enough revenue in taxes. And if you look at a ranking of countries of tax revenue relative to GDP, Pakistan is like the one of, if not the absolute lowest. The tax burden, especially on the well-off and elites, is very, very low. And that's reflective of the exercise of power amongst those elites in Pakistani politics to ensure that that burden is low. Like I said, the elites in Pakistan don't especially care about the welfare of the country. They're mostly out for themselves. And those taxes are definitely evidence of that. So the result is that even though the country has had chronic debt problems over the past 10 to 20 years, the government has refused to substantively increase taxes, rather, on the people who are the most well off. And mind you, it's not an issue of like left versus right, because they have no issue at all raising taxes on everybody else. All of the working people, even if they're extremely poor, like the guys living like feudal peasants, like out in rural areas, those guys have seen their taxes increase. Like everybody has seen a greater tax burden in the form of direct income taxes, as well as fees, value added tax, like all kinds of things. Everybody except the upper middle class and upper class, like they've escaped that. And given that that's where most of the money is in Pakistan, the result has been chronic deficits that have gotten worse over time, to the point that international markets really just don't have much of any confidence in Pakistan's ability to pay them back if they lend the money, the result being debt crises. So the IMF has bailed out Pakistan, I think, twice in like 10 years now. I think the most recent government just negotiated a year or two ago a new bailout, which of course has not been very popular. But bailouts never are. They always come, at least when it comes to the IMF, with a lot of extra requirements. Generally that involves some degree of austerity. So that's pretty much what Pakistan has been struggling with: economic issues. Um, you know, Debt crises and inflation. Inflation right now is 30% per annum in Pakistan. And you can remember how much people in the United States freaked out when it was like 6 to 9%.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was just like 6 to 9% for maybe a year. And that was enough to get people like very riled up and upset. In Pakistan, 30% consistently across several years. It's been rough. And the government hasn't really given much indication that it has the ability to deal with the problem. But when it comes to Pakistan, these economic issues are just the tip of the iceberg. They've actually got a whole litany of other problems, which are kind of more interest to me at this point, given that they kind of tie in with Sino-American competition. For those of you who don't know, Pakistan is China's most reliable partner internationally. There's other countries that might be closer to China. Cambodia comes to mind. Maybe North Korea. North Korea is definitely dependent on China in many ways, but it's also kind of a wild card. The dictator of North Korea kind of does whatever the fuck the dictator of North Korea wants to do. Whether or not China wants it or not isn't necessarily the biggest factor. So while North Korea has been a consistent Chinese ally, they haven't always been the most reliable one. Pakistan, by contrast, has what they both like to call a all-weather friendship. And it's been not only consistent, but reliable over the past half century. So Pakistan and China have pretty good relations, and in turn, in so much as China is trying to expand its influence in the world, Pakistan is one of the key vectors for China to expand its influence in South Asia and Central Asia and kind of sort of the Middle East. Pakistan's not in the Middle East, but it's sort of adjacent, so kind of same general area. So it can be worth following for that reason. But unfortunately for China, even if the Pakistani government maintains and respects a quote unquote all weather friendship with China, Pakistan itself is just kind of too unstable for that friendship to really be operationalized into a big strategic advantage for China. So the case in point here is Gwadar Port. So what is Gwadar Port? That's a port in southern Pakistan on the Indian Ocean that the Chinese government has been trying to develop into a major cargo terminal in conjunction with the Pakistani government. And it was originally supposed to take like 5 to 10 years, and now it's coming up on like 20, because there's just continual problems as far as resources, funding, corruption. There's always something new going on. They have made progress, but it's not really close to completion. It would be great for China if they could finish it, because the idea with Gwadar Port is that if, say, a hostile navy from another country were to cut off Chinese imports from the Straits of Malacca or the South China Sea or some other key naval bottleneck, then China could hypothetically still get resources from goods imported through Gwadar Port that could be unloaded at the port and then transported across Pakistan and then into China. So that's the strategic value of Gwadar for China, rather. And it's just not really happening. Like it's taken forever to reach anything near completion, and it's still got a ways to go. And I don't know if it'll necessarily ever really be complete. It's one of those kinds of projects where the Pakistani government has an incentive to drag it out, because the more it gets dragged out, the more money China spends on it. And of course, the more money China spends on it, the more you get the sunk cost fallacy, right? We've already spent so much money on this over so much time that we can't really just quit and leave now. So it's one of those kinds of projects that kind of asymptotically approaches completion, a phenomena very familiar if you've ever been a grad student.
You said this is
Lots of
Gwadar
grad
Port?
students. Sorry, what?
You said this is Gwadar Port?
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact pronunciation, but it's spelled like that, Gwadar Port.
I have it up on the map. It's on the southern, like very southwest corner of Pakistan.
Yeah.
And it juts out into the water, which is pretty crazy.
Well, I think most of that is artificial. I think they kind of dredged up, soil and whatnot, and then filled in areas so that they could create that, so it can be a decent sized port. I think. I'm not entirely sure. But the location of Gwadar is actually a problem, or at least an additional problem for the project, because it's located in a province of Pakistan called Baluchistan. And the ethnic Baluchi population that is indigenous to Baluchistan is not really on the best of terms with the Pakistani government. There's a lot of separatist sentiment there that centers partly around resources. Baluchistan is one of those territories that doesn't have a lot of people, but it's geographically large and has a lot of natural resources. And they would like to see more of the money from those resources be retained in Baluchistan, but as is, more of it goes towards the central government. So that has people unhappy. What has people even more unhappy is the way that the central government treats them. People who criticize the government, criticize the military, criticize economic policy in Baluchistan, it's not uncommon for them to disappear or have accidents, quote unquote. For those of you who may be not familiar with Pakistani politics, the army is the main political actor in Pakistan. They do have civilian political parties and a civilian political structure, but since independence, the army has been the main institution, and they've very frequently throughout Pakistan's history intervened into politics to get their way, to protect what they could perceive to be policy areas that they believe should be reserved exclusively for the army. And they've also launched multiple coups over the course of Pakistan's history, seizing power outright and only begrudgingly giving it up to civilian actors. But even when they give up power to civilian actors, it's only really superficial. Like, everybody knows where the real power is. And they continue to meddle in politics, even when civilian parties are nominally in control of the country. So, the army is a major actor, largely independent, largely autonomous in terms of security policy, regardless of what politicians voted into office want them to do. And because being a military, they tend to be pretty nationalistic in outlook. They don't like centrifugal separatist forces, or really even people who just criticize the government, or especially the army. So they tend to take a pretty hard line on what they see as subversion, but which other places would just call freedom of speech, right? Criticism of the government. And the heavy hand that they take on people they perceive as separatist in Baluchistan has basically just fed the problem over time and made it worse. And the result is that over the past 20 years in particular, there's been a growing low-intensity conflict in Baluchistan. It's not an outright rebellion per se yet, but there are radical separatist forces that propagate violence of one kind or another against forces of Pakistan or their allies in Baluchistan in order to protest the government's policies there. So mostly hit-and-run tactics, terrorism, what have you, stuff like that. But they're nowhere near strong enough for like sustained insurgent operations, or certainly not for an outright rebellion, at least as of yet. But it's relevant for the talk here because those activities, that political violence that they engage in, if not also the state's political violence that they perpetrate in return, makes the province especially unstable. And that's actually been one of the factors that's held up the development of Gwadar port. Because periodically you'll hear about a busload of Chinese engineers or something like that getting blown up or attacked or whatever. Just a week or two ago, there was, I think, about half a dozen to a dozen Chinese nationals that were killed by Baluchi separatists in southwestern Pakistan. So, stuff like that kind of makes it hard to recruit people. If you're a Chinese worker, an engineer or whatever, who the company responsible for the project is trying to hire, you may be pretty reluctant to go to a place where Chinese nationals have targets on their back. Because again, the Chinese government has a very positive relationship with Pakistan. And so China and Chinese probably more generally are seen as allies of the government, which in turn makes them the enemies of the Baluchi separatists. Honestly, it wouldn't really surprise me if India's intelligence agency had some hands in that too, but I can't prove that. I've never seen any evidence to substantiate that, but given how much support the Pakistani government has given to groups in Kashmir, as well as just terrorist groups generally, it would not surprise me if the RAW, as it's called, India's intelligence agency, retaliated in kind by supporting Baluchi separatists, if not also, Pashtun separatists in the Northwest Frontier Territory. That's a whole other conversation unto itself. And I think politically, the drama in Pakistan has regarded Imran Khan. I don't know if you remember us talking about him.
Imran Khan?
Imran Khan. Yeah, it's been a long time since we've brought him up, but if you can't really talk about Pakistani politics right now without talking about Khan. He had been a reformist candidate. He was actually a famous cricket player. He was a cricket star, which is how his name got to be really well known. And after he kind of got out of cricket, he started up his own political party, the PTI. And he ran as a reformist candidate that wanted to, clean up the government, fight corruption, et cetera, all this kind of stuff. And he was never especially successful. The two major coalitions in Pakistani politics, one led by Nawaz Sharif, which was, he was the leader of the Muslim League. Well, one of the Muslim League parties. There's actually multiple. He was one major pole, and then the other major pole in Pakistani politics was Benazir Bhutto and her husband, what's his face, Zardari or something, I forget. They led the Pakistan People's Party, if memory serves. For those of you who maybe don't remember, Benazir Bhutto was the major Pakistani leader who was assassinated in a suicide attack, maybe like 10 years ago or so. Definitely made the news for a while. People kind of made it out to be like a major dramatic loss for Pakistan. And the Pakistani guy I talked to about it was not as sympathetic about it. His attitude is that she was just as corrupt as all of the other politicians in Pakistan. So, no great loss there. Kind of a lateral move, really, for the country as a whole. But Yeah, as far as like international fame, some people may remember the reporting about Benazir Bhutto back in the day. But anyway, those were the two major parties. Imran Khan and the PTI were like bit players. They were just too small to really make a difference. But eventually, something happened, which is that the Pakistani army, as is its wont, decided that it was tired of Nawaz Sharif's Muslim League government, and they turned on him. And they didn't want to make a deal with the PPP, the other big party, because they weren't on good terms with them either. And so they decided to cut a deal with Imran Khan and the PTI. And with the support of the army, the PTI was able to do much better in the elections. Having support from the army basically effectively means you have the full support of the Pakistani state behind you. And they were able to use that power not only to build their patronage network, get more people to vote for them, but also to harass the opponents they were running against. So, combined, that meant a big PTI victory for the first time in its history. And again, this was down to an alliance, an explicit alliance between Imran Khan and the Pakistani army. That's the only reason it happened. But Imran Khan made it out to be that he was like the leader of Pakistan. Even though he certainly knew that the army retained the power, the real power in the country, he still tried to challenge it, and that's what eventually led to a falling out between the army and Imran Khan. And ultimately, the result is that there were a number of charges brought against Khan. Basically, the judiciary was sicked on him. They basically just invented charges to use against him, to the point where he ended up being thrown in jail. And eventually, new elections were called, and the PTI, unsurprisingly, did much worse, because at this point, the Pakistani army had created a new deal with, you guessed it, Nawaz Sharif of the Muslim League. They made up, played nice, and agreed that Sharif would have support of the government this time. So, PTI got kicked out, lost a bunch of seats, and the Muslim League came back in. However, Imran Khan did not go quietly into the night. He encouraged his followers to engage in mass protests because he believed he was being screwed over, which, was true. And he wanted to challenge the government's authority on this, especially the authority of the army. And the result is that a bunch of his followers actually ended up not only protesting, but rioting at the homes of a leading Pakistani army general. And that's a big taboo. That's a bold move in Pakistan. And people didn't have to wait long to see the result. Like, the army started cracking down on supporters of the PTI, started putting pressure on PTI politicians in the legislature to leave the party and join other parties, or at least to become independent. Like, they really cracked down hard. And Khan, by this point, was in jail. But he still didn't quit. And the people, for their part, actually still supported him. Obviously, the Muslim League and Sharif was able to win the election, but they didn't win by as big of a margin as they were expecting. The PTI actually managed to retain pretty significant support. So even as the weight of the army, the administrative state, and all of these establishment parties were brought against them, they were able to hold out and continue to pressure the army and the government to release Khan and allow the PTI to run in honest, truly free and fair elections. And the army has not bent on this. They're pretty hell-bent on keeping Khan and the PTI out. And I don't know how much protesting is going to change their mind on that. But every so often, the PTI kind of pops up again to prove that they're still relevant. Like, there were regional elections in the province of Punjab, and the PTI outperformed everybody. They certainly outperformed all expectations for a party that the government had effectively banned by that point. So they're still there, still popular, still around, and Khan's followers are still heaping pressure on the Pakistani government to give up, basically, and give power back to the guy that they see as still being the legitimate leader of Pakistan. Obviously, the intensity of the protests have kind of waned over time. It's not as intense as it used to be, but they still occasionally flare up. Khan definitely still has support. And so in that way, he represents one of the biggest challenges to the army's monopoly, so to speak, on politics in Pakistan in its history. I don't think Khan is going to win. I think the army still has the high cards here. But the fact that he's held on as long as he has is pretty notable. So, maybe he can cut some kind of deal or maybe there could be some kind of broader movement that emerges that actually results in substantive changes to Pakistan's political culture. It's unclear, but any of that would be like a medium to long-term change. In the short term, Khan's in jail, the PTI is scattered, like there's just too many barriers for them to really challenge. But I think the government and the army in particular definitely kind of feels public sentiment shifting against them. Because even before, when the army was popular, relatively speaking, when people were demanding a return to civilian government, even in those cases, the army was still a relatively prestigious institution. It was seen as the most powerful leading institution in Pakistan, the most developed institution, the most expertise. People who were officers and whatnot were kind of looked up to. This is stuff I've heard from Pakistanis, by the way. I know not everybody agrees with that. There was one Pakistani guy in chat who didn't like me describing things that way. But in general, the army is like the most advanced institution. And the fact that that's changing really kind of bodes some degree of more substantive change in the future, because that's the real game changer here as far as structural changes in Pakistani politics. So it remains to be seen if anything comes of that, but if that weren't happening, there would be virtually no prospect for substantive change. So there is some room for optimism there.
Chat says the next video title should be The Cricket Player to Tyrant Pipeline.
Well, I mean, again, he was never really in power, so I don't think you could call Khan a tyrant. Whoever the prime minister of Pakistan is mostly just a symbolic leader, really. There are some levers they can pull. There are some realms of politics that they have discretion on, but by and large, the army is the one that's really in charge.
They're checked and balanced by the military and the military.
Yeah, thoroughly dominated.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to know who holds the keys to the kingdom in Pakistan, don't look at the prime minister. Look at the commander-in-chief of the army.
Very true. Yeah, Pakistan, I think mentally people register it as a Middle Eastern country when really it's got a blend of Middle Eastern culture and Indian culture, right?
Mostly Indian. But yeah,
Indian.
it is a blend. Yeah, between the two, South Asian culture is like easily the more dominant one. It was part of India, right? It was all British India at one point. Yeah. So, culturally speaking, they have a lot in common. Like the main language of Pakistan, Urdu, is mutually intelligible with one of the national languages of India, that being Hindi. I think we've talked before about how they actually technically are just the same language, but that just kind of underscores how much similarity there is. In so much as there's differences, they're largely artificial differences that were created by nationalists after independence. But you are totally correct that there's a lot of Middle Eastern and Central Asian influences in Pakistan. They've definitely, Islam being principal case in point, but also just things like poetry, the Persian language, loan words, stuff like that. There was a lot of in-migration from the Arab world and the broader Muslim world, really, over the course of the past 1,000 years. Much more so into, Pakistan than the rest of South Asia, obviously, just because Pakistan is right there, adjacent to those other regions.
Mm-hmm. Stands to reason.
Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but it's unexpected, let's put it like that Pakistan ended up being more politically dysfunctional than India, because that was not the prediction in 1947. Right? That was when Pakistan and India were still British India, still together. And the British partitioned British India, creating India and Pakistan, such as we know them today, in 1947. And the expectation at the time is that India, being the larger and more diverse country, would have more political problems than Pakistan, which was more homogenous and smaller. Also, there was a little bit of prejudice on the part of, especially the British at the time. They were a little bit prejudiced against Hinduism in favor of Islam. They saw Muslims as, maybe not quite equals to Christians. Yeah, that's a little too progressive for 1947, but they saw Muslim as being more like Christianity, and so they tended to prefer it. And they also had just lots of criticisms of, some of the really old school barbaric shit that some Hindu priests still practiced, and that kind of disproportionately colored foreign perspectives of Hinduism in India. So because of that particular prejudice, there was an expectation that Muslim Pakistan would outperform Hindu India.
Huh.
So that was the prediction in 1947. And they ended up totally wrong. India was much more functional, was much better at preserving its democratic institutions. That's not to say they didn't have problems, but they ended up being much better able to navigate those problems while maintaining their democratic political institutions than Pakistan did. Pakistan didn't even really make it 10 years. Pakistan had independence, they had a democratic government, and then they had to negotiate a new constitution for that government, and then they proceeded to fail to do so for 10 straight years. And then in the 10th year, the Pakistani army finally threw up its hands and said, fuck it, we're just going to take over and we're going to impose a constitution on you. And that really set the tenor for Pakistan's political culture. The politicians bicker and accomplish fuck all and just rob brazenly from the public. And then the military steps in and actually runs things and gets things done. That's pretty much been the pattern ever since. And it's very unfortunate, because it's obviously had dire consequences for, the overall health of the political culture and whatnot. But, unless you have a time machine, there's not much you can do about it.
Interesting. So people probably have a varied opinion on the military of whether it's good or bad. It depends on the time frame.
I think most people would be pretty critical, especially at this point. But I think the issue is that people are even more critical of political parties, which again tend to be very, very corrupt, right? They're not political parties like we would think of them in the West. In Europe, they have sort of these ideological parties that are based around collective action, like labor parties or pro-business parties, whatever, traditional conservative versus socialist, basically. And in the United States, we kind of have something similar, although it tends to be more decentralized. It's more grassroots. But in general, the political parties represent, roughly speaking, the perspectives of the broader public. In a political system like Pakistan, political parties are de facto businesses that are run by powerful and popular elites who sometimes trade off of their celebrity, other times just off of patronage that they dispense to the public. But, regardless, it's mostly about the money. They can give favors in exchange for votes, and whoever promises the most for votes ends up winning. Although some of it also just has to do with personal relations. Some parties have strong ties to individual communities in a given region, and it could be very difficult for a competing party to move in and supplant those individual personal relationships that overlap between the lower ranks of a given party and the broader community. That creates a steep barrier to entry to political competition. And that's one of the ways that political parties in Pakistan have kind of maintained their perseverance across time. In the case of the Pakistan People's Party, the PPP, Benazir Bhutto's party, their core strength is in Sindhi province, which is the southern province of Pakistan. There's only really four, right? There's Baluchistan, Punjab, Sindhi. Those are the main ones. And then there's the Northwest Frontier province, which is, kind of sort of a province. And then there's whatever the fuck is going on in Azad Kashmir. Call it a province, call it an independent state that's associated with Pakistan, however you want to frame that. But yeah, the core four are Baluchistan, Sindhi, Punjab, and what was it, the other one? I guess Northwest Frontier Province would really be the fourth one. But again, that's kind of, yeah. But yeah, Sindhi is the PPP, and then Nawaz Sharif's Muslim League. Their core base of support is in Punjab. And there's a couple other parties, but they're just kind of too small to really make too much of a difference. There's a Pashtun reformist / nationalist party that's pretty popular in the Northwest Frontier province, but the army kind of sees them as being a little too ethno-nationalist to the point that they see them as separatists, and so they've actually kind of tried to stamp that out. So they have a hard time winning seats at this point. There's also a party called the MQM. I don't remember what that stands for, but I think that's the correct acronym. Basically, they're a party for people who are called muhajirs. And I apologize for butchering the pronunciation again. But muhajirs are basically migrants. They're Muslims who had lived in India before partition, but then moved to Pakistan because of partition. And these are generally people who come from areas of India that are ethnically and linguistically distinct from those of Pakistan. And so all of these, millions of Muslims that came over to Pakistan after partition frequently did not have much in common with the people in the areas that they ended up moving in and settling in. And so the result is that these people ended up, formally citizens, like they were embraced and accepted, but because they were so different ethnically speaking, they ended up kind of forming these gateway communities that were somewhat closed off from the rest of the country. And that made them prime targets for a political party catering to their specific experience and needs. And that was the MQM. Unfortunately, it's been associated with like significant corruption. Even for Pakistan, it's kind of seen as being especially corrupt, and it's also involved in a lot of like organized crime and killings and assassinations, stuff like that. MQM kind of has a wild history in that way. But yeah, just different regions kind of have these are kind of the power bases for these different parties, to varying degrees. The PTI is kind of unique in that it doesn't have a specific region it can kind of call its power base. It's kind of broadly popular amongst broad swaths of the country. And again, that's not unusual. Like in a political culture like that, it's your ability to leverage votes. Patronage is the main way, but if you're a celebrity like Khan, that's also workable. People like Khan because he basically won at cricket. So that it sounds goofy, but like you can think of like similar celebrity presidents, like say Donald Trump, right? He's not necessarily the best politician. He's not very experienced at politics, but he's very charismatic, and the people see him as being genuine, and that garners him a lot of trust and support, much more so than he would get if he were just an old school establishment politician.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of such, is there any update on projections for the election this coming week, and also how long do you think it will take?
Man, I don't know. It really depends on how things shake out. There's already been some reports of people destroying ballots, which is not a good sign. Fortunately, I think all of the cases I've heard about have occurred in like Oregon, basically states that where the outcome is not like in question, at least as far as the presidential election. Like everybody knows how that's going to shake out. So it's probably not too impactful now, but we were really kind of hoping for 0 incidents, so having them at all is not particularly encouraging. So if there's more shenanigans like that, you can bet that there's going to be prolonged litigation, and in that case it could be considerable time before we know who won the election. But if everything goes according to plan, maybe a week. If the election is as close as it's projected to be, it may take a week to count every vote, so to speak, and come to a final count for the swing states, which are the ones everybody's paying attention to. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin being the main ones at this point.
Did you end up watching Trump on the Joe Rogan show?
No, I still haven't sat down and watched all the way through it. I've actually been spending more time on Ballotpedia, trying to figure out what all of these propositions are about. There's like 24 some propositions Dallas County is going to be voting on, so I've been trying to figure out what the fuck is going on there with all of those, so I don't just arrive on polling day and kind of just try to wing it, figuring out what they're about and what they're going to do. You kind of do have to do some homework when it comes to propositions, because even though they do tell you what the proposition will do on the ballot, you don't really know the context behind it, or what the intended or unintended effect of the proposition will be. So for that, you kind of need to do more reading. In my case, the Dallas Morning News kind of broke it down. I found an article that kind of explored them a little more. There was actually a Facebook group that kind of talked about them. And of course, there was a random guy in the Dallas subreddit who did like this really intensive review of each and every proposition and the pros and cons of each. There's always a guy who's just hyper fixated like that. God bless him. I appreciate the effort.
Yeah, it saves the rest of us time.
Yeah, but you can only trust Reddit comments so much, right? You can't take that to the bank. But I did appreciate the extra feedback, so I did kind of account for all of the different sources to kind of draw conclusions. So, I was able to kind of draw up a plan for how I wanted to vote on all of them once I kind of figured out what was going on. But it took some work. I think if I had just gone in without doing the homework, I would have been voting against. I would be voting in a different way on some of them than I would have, than I am going to, basically, now that I've actually reviewed the details. I was actually talking to a friend in China about local elections in the United States recently. She was kind of curious how you kind of learn about all the different people running and whatnot. And of course, being Chinese, living in an authoritarian country, she's very skeptical about the whole thing. They always are. How do you know this isn't all bullshit? How can you trust all these media sources to not be biased in favor of one or the other candidate? Blah blah blah. The usual stuff, basically. They're kind of indoctrinated. Well, not indoctrinated per se, but living in an authoritarian system inculcates paranoia and skepticism. They really don't trust political institutions of any kind. And so I kind of explained to her that yes, there is bias in the reporting and whatnot, but that just means that you have to do more reading. Basically, there's not like one source that you go to. You kind of have to shop around. Maybe talk to people, etc.
Yeah, it's funny. Whenever you're trying to figure out what these ballots are, like, you have to basically sift through all the sponsored pages at the top of either side is going to bat hard for one outcome or the other. And it's nice whenever you can find a source that's talking about who might be invested to vote one way or another and who it might benefit and who it might be more expensive for. Like in California, we have a proposition that's going currently that landlords really don't like this, but renters do like this. So what do you want to vote kind of depends on whether you're a landlord or a renter. And if you're neither of those things and you don't care, then it's not as critical of an item for you. And even if you might be in favor of it, it might not impact you personally. So there's a lot going on in these propositions, and the execution of implementing them is also its own thing. Like, you're not guaranteed to have this exactly as it's written on the ballot right now. It's going to be something that takes time and investment and multiple people working toward it. So, and then also accountability to whatever the proposition is, which requires a faith in democratic norms and rule of law and all that. So
yeah, it's work, but it's worth it. And keep in mind, the local elections are actually more important than the presidential election. Not to say the presidential election is not important, but as far as your vote counting for more and carrying more weight, definitely local elections are where your vote really counts. So pay attention to those. Even if you don't want to vote for president, definitely show up to vote for all the other stuff. Yeah, I'm mostly caught up on the politicians running, but I still need to dig into the ballot and figure out who's running for all of the judge positions. Texas is one of the states where judges are elected. And it's kind of a problem because, like, you don't really pay too much attention to them. They generally focus more on their jobs. Like, being a politician means you generally have more opportunities to just engage in grandstanding and stuff like that. You can kind of get your name out there doing a bunch of stupid shit for theatrical reasons. But judges, they actually do have to, like, sit in court and be a judge, right? And that takes up a lot of time. So it can be a little bit hard to kind of get a feel for them. So I'm going to have to work a little harder on that, assuming that there are multiple people running. Some of the races only have one person running. Gerrymandering will do that. I think we have a House rep we're going to vote for here in Dallas, and she's not really running against anybody. There's no Republican Party candidate running against her. Like, it's pretty much guaranteed she's going to win. The only person running against her is like this libertarian guy, and you know, if his Twitter account is anything to go by, he's not an especially serious candidate.
Is he like full Vermin Supreme or not quite?
No, I mean, I think he is kind of trying, but it's one of those campaigns that kind of toes the line between trolling and actual substantive campaign. It's a little hard to tell the difference in his case.
Mm-hmm.
You know, regardless, I'm not that interested. He talked a lot about election fraud and that kind of stuff, and that kind of turned me off. So I was like, all right, buddy,
Yeah.
you do you.
Tinfoil hat is not really what you go for when you're voting.
Well, what about you? Have you been looking at your ballot?
Yeah, I voted.
Oh, that's right. You already voted.
Yeah, it was kind of funny. Just Googling some of the candidates and seeing what news was out there for them. Because for certain appointed positions, it's like a position within a board of something else, and you've never heard of this before, and you're probably never going to hear of this again. But it's something that does need to be decided, and you have to decide one of these people based on the information that they have on their website, and then what other information is out there, just for them to post about themselves or trouble that they've gotten in from something in the past. There was one person who I decided not to vote for because of the breakdown of the debate, I think, between them and the person they were contending with. And in the debate, they were the person who won the previous seat. But in this discussion, they were apparently just bashing their opponent from the very start, like before they even articulated how their term went, like what did you get done. And they were saying that if you're in such a debate and you are the incumbent candidate, meaning that you won last time and you're defending that spot, you should focus on basically beating your chest about all the awesome stuff that you did in this past term and why you should be brought in for a second term to kind of expand upon that. But this person apparently just went with the bashing routine, which is a valid strategy, but maybe not always the best one.
Yeah, some people go hard. Sometimes they get something to show for it, but it certainly doesn't do anything to inculcate a positive environment in the political culture.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little flustering to see when it crops up. But that's just part of living in a democracy.
Yep.
Kind of comes down to the public to encourage good candidates and discourage the bad candidates. So in so much as we have more bad than good at any given time, that's more a reflection of the public than anything.
One thing that I was kind of musing about with my girlfriend Trisha the other day was the actual power of the role of the president and what actually changes for citizens, because the banter surrounding who's going to win or not in the election is very clickbaity and culture wars and kind of silly in terms of how some people will talk about it and how catastrophic their language will be. So yeah, for the U.S. president, we do thankfully have some checks and some balances on their power. They can't just go into the office and do whatever they want. We do have a decent bit of idiot proofing. Whether you believe that the Democrats or the Republicans are the real idiots, there are some systems in place to prevent an abuser of the system from running away with it. And then, something that was being served to me on social media. I have no idea why. World's coolest dictator. Just him talking about anything. People love him. I had never seen how he dresses himself, but very fancy, charismatic. Almost like he's kind of a lord figure in a medieval or a Renaissance setting. He's got a unique pizzazz to it.
Yeah.
And relatively eloquent, so I can see why he would have a following and a decent bit of influence. There was one where he was talking about criminals and how I believe that God will forgive people for whatever crimes or whatever, but it's the job of government to punish them and keep them in prison from other people. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, he gets around. Was he speaking in English?
I actually didn't have this sound on.
Just subtitles?
Yeah. So I don't know.
Well, he does occasionally kind of crop up in English language media. Like he was a guest speaker at a big conservative convention earlier this year. I think it's called CPAC. It tends to be a little more radical than like the mainstream Republican strand of thought. So they sometimes veer off into weird territory. And inviting Bukele kind of qualified. You know, they wanted him to come and talk about how you can use the state to crack down and significantly reduce crime and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Kind of plays well with the law and order crowd, even though you can't really do the kind of stuff Bukele is doing in the United States, at least not legally. So he does have kind of a fan club on the right here as a result, which made it all the weirder when Trump at the Republican nomination convention, at the Republican convention rather, actually kind of talked him down a little bit, because Bukele has been pretty Trump friendly. I don't know how pro-Trump he's necessarily been, but you know, he's kind of talked about him in a positive way and whatnot. So, and given that he's been trying to like reduce crime such that fewer people in El Salvador are leaving for the United States, you'd think Trump would be pretty pro-Bukele, but you know how it is with Trump. He kind of gives these long, rambling speeches that just sort of meander around, and somehow he talked himself into a position where he kind of had to talk badly about Bukele and talked about how they're not actually dealing with the criminal problem and they're lying about it and they're still coming across the border, and that if you vote for him, he'll actually finally stop it, blah, blah, blah. Like, just total bullshit. Like, just a total 180 from, like, the way he talked about Bukele in previous speeches. So, very strange. Very prototypical Trumpian rhetoric, you could say. But I think even in spite of that, Bukele is still on fairly good terms with Trump. You know, they have similar styles of governance, in so much as they're both sort of these charismatic figures. I don't want to say autocrat per se. You know, I would say Bukele definitely qualifies as an autocrat at this point, but Trump not quite yet is an autocrat. He doesn't really have enough power yet in the American political system. He's certainly got enough voter support, but he's going to have to build broader institutional support in the American government to really do much more. I think people would be very disappointed in him if he ever actually did do that, because I think at that point you would finally see just how little he actually cares about a lot of the stuff he talks about. I don't really see Trump as being a solution to any major political problem in the United States. If you like him, then like him. You know, like I've said before on here, I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you what to believe in, but I'm very skeptical. I think all of the good things Trump has done that he can be credited with, or that his administration can be credited with, are just stuff that like any Republican president would have done. I welcome feedback on that. I'm always interested in a conversation, but that is my impression right now.
Well, the thing that a lot of people don't account for is that whenever you're passing a new policy, usually you have the backing of Congress in some sense, which that's going to be a lot of the legwork and credit of the people who are there and voting on that and kind of make compromises and build coalitions and that kind of thing. So, yeah, just because something happened during a president's run doesn't mean that they were the main driving force. It helps if they talk about it and they might have a clear part in the process, but I think just to keep it simple, we end up giving the president more recognition and responsibility than they actually exert.
Yeah, the imperial presidency is definitely a thing, but they're not gods. We doing okay on time?
Yeah. Been going for about hour 20.
Gotcha. Oh, right. The China Week thing. So a couple weeks ago, there was a guy asking about the China Week bills that were passed in the House of Representatives. And I said that I hadn't looked into them, but that I would, and that I would eventually do like a tier list ranking how actually useful that they would be if they eventually do become law. I would point out here that these are House bills that were passed. These are not laws. They would have to be also passed by the Senate for that to happen, and that's a ways off. You know, generally the way it works is that the House passes a version of a bill, the Senate passes their own version of the same bill, and then they reconcile the two different versions in a protracted negotiation. And then eventually they come up with a common bill that they can both agree on. And then if both chambers pass that bill, then it becomes a law. Also, you know, the president has to sign it, and of course it has to pass judicial muster. It has to be constitutional, blah, blah, blah. But you know, in general, right, that's the process. And as of now, only the House has passed these. So, like, they're at the very beginning of the process. There's no guarantee that any of these will actually become law eventually. Probably some would be my guess. I think some of them are decent. Probably some will be pretty uncontroversial, but invariably there's differences that crop up. And it could be that a lot of this stuff just falls by the wayside just because there's more important priorities. So we'll see. But regardless, I did finally read through them, take notes, rank them, etc. So I don't know if that guy who asked that question still cares, or if he's even still here. But for what it's worth, you know, here it is. And again, apologies, we got delayed a bit because we did the what was it, the bitter sugar thing. You know, we kind of got delayed for 2 weeks because of that. But yeah, we can do that if you're interested, Neuro.
Cool, I'm done.
Okay, so basically I cut these into 3 tiers. Most of them fall into the middle tier, which is the meh tier. These are basically bills that do something that is useful, but not really that useful. Not even necessarily enough to really warrant a bill or a law. It's probably stuff you could have just done administratively, but otherwise has some merit. The third category is just dumb. A lot of that is just stuff that is being done to get attention. You know, sometimes politicians will just do stuff so that they can take credit for doing stuff. It doesn't matter if the stuff they're actually doing is really substantive and actually accomplishes anything. You know, they're just kind of going through the motions. So it looks like they're working, you know, kind of like a guy in an office who kind of taps at his keyboard to look like he's doing something when really he's just wasting time. That's the equivalent behavior here. So the first category is the stuff that's actually substantive and that actually does make a contribution to American foreign policy. And you know, it will probably not surprise you to know that that is the smallest category. Most of them do not fall there. So we'll just kind of go through these, and I'll try to get through it relatively quickly. I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to just bore everybody. But I think it's worth doing this just because it kind of illustrates what this looks like, what this process looks like, and what it's going to look like. Because Sino-American competition is a growing thing. You know, we talked about it back in like 2017, 2018, when people weren't really paying attention to it. And, you know, I think I remember specifically saying back then, you know, you should pay more attention to it because this is going to be a thing. This is going to be headline stuff eventually, a few years down the line. And I was right. So it's important enough now that politicians take it seriously and have tried to build personas around it. Like there's a whole committee now in the House of Representatives that is just dedicated to China and competition with China. And that's actually the committee that, you know, wrote up all of these bills here that we're about to talk about. The trouble, of course, is that politicians are, you know, actors. They engage in theater. And so they don't necessarily always take their job overly seriously. They try to, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes there's only so much you can do, and what little you can do is not necessarily enough to get your name in the papers and to get people familiar with you as a political figure such that you can easily ride your accomplishments to re-election. Sometimes the stuff you do is just too negligible for that, and people just kind of forget you exist. And that's not really why people get involved in politics, and certainly it makes it more difficult to get reelected. So as we go through these, just kind of keep in mind that this is sort of a primer for what we're going to look forward to as the government continues, and specifically legislators continue to wrestle with this problem and to varying degrees use it for their own personal benefit and actually try to substantively address the issue. So we'll start with the substantive stuff. I think that's kind of the more important here, certainly as far as long-term strategy. I'll point out to start with, though, that none of this stuff is going to blow your mind. None of it is going to revolutionize American foreign policy. The stuff that made the substantive tier here is mostly just stuff that makes an incremental improvement that is small but notable as far as the quality of U.S. strategy vis-a-vis China. So with that said, first act, the Protecting American Agriculture from Foreign Adversaries Act of 2024. Long story short, this bill pretty much does two things. One, it makes the Department of Agriculture a de facto member of CFIUS, which is the Council of Foreign Investment, something committee. I forget the full acronym. Let me look it up. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. There you go. That's a committee that was created in order to oversee investment from foreign states that are basically rivals of the United States, to make sure that they're not getting control of critical technologies or resources by way of their investments in the United States. And historically, it hasn't been a very strong institution because historically America's rivals haven't really had the money to invest a whole lot in the United States. But of course, with the rise of China, that circumstance has changed, and there has been significant amounts of Chinese investment in the United States. So that's led to demand for a regulatory body to oversee that, and that basically de facto became CFIUS. Originally it was a much smaller committee. It didn't really do a lot, but over the past 10 years in particular, it's basically been empowered and imbued with more and more responsibility and discretion in how to use that power in order to try to mitigate the threat from Chinese investment as they define it. So that's what CFIUS is, but the Department of Agriculture really hasn't had a role in it. For those of you maybe not familiar with the composition of CFIUS, basically it involves the heads of various departments and agencies within the administrative state that all relate in some way to managing the economy, national security, etc. And they basically just pull them together on this committee so that they can focus on this one particular issue, again, foreign investment. So the Department of Agriculture doesn't really have a purview by itself that ties into this very well, and so they haven't really been involved in the CFIUS's decision-making process. However, that's started to change over the past year or two because there's been more attention paid to the purchase of American land, specifically agricultural land, by Chinese nationals that is near military bases. And to a degree, this is kind of a bullshit talking point because I don't know how substantive the quote-unquote threat actually is, but the narrative that is being pushed here is that Chinese nationals are purchasing land near military bases so that they can surveil and otherwise spy on them, presumably using some kind of electronic equipment.
Like a weather balloon?
I don't know. Sorry, what?
Like a weather balloon.
Well, I don't know that I would call that electronic equipment per se, but yeah, the idea is that they're spying on us and that they're using the purchase of agricultural land to do it. So there's been legislation in individual states to actually regulate, if not just ban completely, the purchase of agricultural land by Chinese nationals. And that's been leveraged now into a move at the national level to basically codify that into a federal law. And corresponding with that effort, there's this corresponding effort to make the Department of Agriculture, which is the department that is kind of relevant to overseeing foreign investment in agricultural land in the United States, to make them a part of CFIUS's process in order to expand CFIUS's ambit to kind of encompass this new agricultural land issue as it's been defined. Now, again, I don't think this is that substantive an issue, and I kind of suspect it's kind of been invented out of whole cloth just so it can be a talking point. Not every talking point in American politics is actually based in reality. Some of them really are just absolute bullshit created for politicians to have something to run on. So this could easily be one of them, but who's to say? Maybe there's some case studies where it's been proven that this was happening. I don't know. I haven't seen any yet, hence my skepticism. Regardless, this particular bill that we're talking about changes it so the Department of Agriculture has a voice on CFIUS. So that is a substantive change, and in so much as the agricultural issue does represent a potentially significant issue as far as national security, it makes sense to do this. Ergo, it is a substantive change, and it makes the top tier here. Now, this bill also does something else. Let me check my notes real quick. Actually, no, it doesn't do anything else. That is the main thing. It does do some other things that are kind of minor technical stuff. Technically, I don't think the Department of Agriculture, for example, is going to have a seat in CFIUS. So they're not like a full member. It's more of like a de facto membership, because technically what can happen now is that the DOA can make a recommendation as far as the CFIUS taking action on barring a given purchase of land. And the CFIUS, according to this law, is going to be obligated to review that and make a decision on it. So that was not the case before. Basically, CFIUS just didn't give a shit about that and wasn't paying any attention. So now they'll have to. So that's the significance here. So the next bill was the Export Control Enforcement and Enhancement Act. So for me, this was top of the list. This was the most important substantive bill that was a part of the 25 bill, China Week package here. And this one does do two things. This is the one I was thinking of. For one, it creates some broader burden as far as actually surveying foreign investment in the United States and reviewing whether or not a given investment needs to be blocked. Because right now, it's mostly the Department of Commerce that does that, right? CFIUS, in conjunction with the Department of Commerce, kind of share responsibility in this broad area of regulating things like investment, export controls, blah, blah, blah. But what this bill proposes to do is to allow different departments that have overlapping authority here, basically on areas that are related to foreign investment and whatnot, to kind of pipe up and give the Department of Commerce recommendations and information about potential cases that they can take action on, potential cases that are in breach of export restrictions or are suspicious activity that could lead to foreign investment type action, et cetera, stuff like this. And by giving these other departments the power to give these recommendations and then obligating the Department of Commerce to act on them, they're giving these other departments an incentive to not only gather information about these cases, but then also to substantively argue them. Because they can't just give random argumentation to the Department of Commerce and then just put the burden on them to investigate it, right? My understanding of the bill is that they're actually going to have to do their own work. If I'm wrong on that, then this bill is going to fall down the tier list. Because if you're just letting other departments dump information on the Department of Commerce, that's not going to do anything to increase the capacity of the Department of Commerce to actually process all of that information. They're already overburdened, so that would not be an improvement. But if you allow, say, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy to gather evidence and make a substantive argument that actually the Department of Commerce should take action on a given case, that represents burden sharing. That means that the resources of other departments can be used to actually investigate some of these, and thereby freeing up resources in the Department of Commerce to look at more important high priority type stuff. So it's kind of an administrative move, which is, I'm sure, boring for a lot of people, but in so much as this makes the process of investigating these kinds of breaches of export restrictions and investment law and whatnot, this could significantly increase the administrative capacity of the state to actually enforce these kinds of trade rules. And in so much as that's the case, this does represent a significant improvement in the state's ability to compete with China. So the bill is notable in that regard. Now, the other thing that this bill changes is that it shifts the burden of proof onto the people applying for licenses. Right now, there's a number of technologies and goods that you have to get a license in order to export to a country on a list, basically China, Russia, North Korea, etc. And you can actually get that license to do that, but you have to go through a process. And the government historically has basically looked at your license application and has to come up with a reason to deny you. They have to look at the substance of the application, the risks involved, etc. And then, according to the law, they have to point at something and say, this precludes you from being able to get this license. So the change this bill makes is it switches it. Right now, well, not right now, but if this bill becomes law, there's going to be what's called a presumption of denial of license. And so what that means is that the burden is no longer on the government to come up with a reason not to give you the license when you apply for it to export critical technologies to countries like China. Instead, the burden is going to be on you, the applicant, to come up with a reason for why you should get the license. And that's a much different process. It sounds like a superficial change, but it's actually not. For one, this frees up a lot of resources for the government because they can basically just sit on their ass, look at the application, and if it's not good enough, they can just scratch it. But more to the point, it represents a significant barrier to entry for anybody who actually wants to get one of these licenses, because now they have to spend a bunch of money on lawyers and whatnot that they would not have otherwise had to spend money on in order to try to make their license application as robust and airtight as possible. So this represents a significant administrative burden to entry for these licenses. And in so much as that's the case, it represents a significant increase in the barrier to trade between China and the United States as far as the critical technologies that are covered by American export restrictions. So a substantive move here for this bill. Out of all the bills on this list, I think this one is probably the most likely to end up actually becoming a law. Because again, this one actually does substantively increase the efficiency of the government and its agencies, and actually does represent a significant raising of the barrier to trade between China and the United States, which a lot of China hawks kind of want at this point for one reason or another. So points here for actually writing up a decent bill that actually does try to do something substantive. Top tier bill here. Okay, so the next bill in the substantive list is the Remote Access Security Act, and this is a pretty small one, but it does kind of close a loophole that had been pretty glaring before. So there's a number of technologies that are supposed to have export restrictions on them, but the loophole was that in some cases, those technologies could actually be accessed remotely. So for example, if you had some kind of cloud computing set up in the United States, and there was some technology maybe regarding quantum computing or the design thereof, if you're sitting in China, you could actually access information about that technology, or maybe even the technology itself, on cloud networks in the United States and have that not be a breach of export restrictions. And so what this bill does is it changes that. It actually expands the remit of the administrative state in the United States, specifically the Department of Commerce, to encompass cloud computing, so that they can, if necessary, expand export restrictions to encompass technologies that are possibly available on cloud computing, and thereby preventing the access of actors like China to that cloud computing in order to actually make the enforcement of the export restrictions airtight. Because again, before you could just easily get around them in certain cases with certain technologies. So it makes sense, basically. It's a small thing, but clear-cut loophole, so good on them for trying to close it, basically. And that's it for the substantive tier list. That's all of the stuff that actually really accomplishes anything of importance. It's just 3. Right. So the second tier here is stuff that kind of accomplishes stuff, but not really in particular. A lot of it is just superficial. So the first bill here is the Countering the PRC Malign Influence Fund Authorization Act. And what this does is it gives about $1.63 billion to the State Department and to USAID over 5 years in order to, quote unquote, fund organizations that spread anti-China propaganda around the world, end quote.
What?
Yeah, it's kind of stupid, right? Because basically you're just paying people to shitpost online. And there's different schools of thought on that. I know a lot of people worry about like foreign interference and misinformation on social media, but I'm very much of the school that thinks the impact of that stuff is way overstated. I very much discount it as a significant factor in political outcomes. So for me, spending $1 billion on that, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I think it's going to be a waste of money. However, I didn't put it in the trash tier list because I recognize that China, specifically the Chinese government, spends a lot of money on misinformation too. And it does make some sense to engage in tit for tat there. If they're going to do it, there's not really any reason for the United States to also do it, even if it's just to basically be a reaction to the Chinese efforts. Because clearly the Chinese government thinks it's effective, and if they think it's effective, presumably they will not like it if the United States tries to do it to them. And so by doing that, by kind of engaging in this tit for tat, the United States government does generate some leverage for itself. We can promise to tone down our shit posting in exchange for something that the Chinese government wants, or maybe even turn it off completely if the offer is good enough. And so long as the Communist Party of China thinks that shit posting like that has an effect, then that leverage is real. So I see some merit for it in that case. But as far as substantively moving public opinion around the world about China with this, I'm very dubious. Let's see. So the next one was the Chinese Currency Accountability Act of 2023. And the idea here is to weaken the renminbi. That's how it was described in the article I read. But when I dug into the details, it was mostly just bullshit. So in this case, the idea is to stop the IMF from including the renminbi in the SDR. And for those of you who don't know what an SDR is, it's a special drawing right. It's basically an artificial currency that was created by the IMF in order to act as a stabilizing force in cases where currencies were just fluctuating wildly. And originally, decades ago, it was envisioned as being a potential like global currency that could replace all of the other currencies. And the idea was that it could be, kind of run from the IMF as a stabilizing force. This is an economist thing. Economists believe that multiple currencies act as a barrier to trade, and that would be kind of better off without them. There are different schools of thought on that, but in general, that's the idea. Having to change currencies, that's just extra friction that you don't need in what would otherwise be frictionless trade. So that's roughly the idea that they had back in the day. Since then, the SDR has kind of persisted, but it's more of just like a minor technical thing. It's something that they keep around just for emergencies. Like in cases where economies have been near collapse and they need liquidity, sometimes the IMF will break out SDRs to try to help them out, because that's just one of the tools in their toolkit. But otherwise, it's not very important. However, the Chinese government has been making an effort to try to introduce the renminbi into the SDR's basket, because that's actually where the SDR's value comes from. The SDR is not like a currency that's printed per se. It's rather a kind of artificial digital currency, basically, that is predicated on the value of a basket of currencies that are pooled together and used to calculate its value. And, those currencies are things like the Swiss franc, the Japanese yen, the US dollar, the euro, blah, 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 like all the usual suspects. But the Chinese government argues that one of the ways that they could legitimize the renminbi around the world, technically it would be the yuan. China's currency has different names depending on where it's traded. In China, renminbi; outside of China, internationally, it's the yuan. So I should be calling it the yuan here. So one of the ways that the Chinese government wants to legitimize the yuan in international trade and try to increase its usage is to try to get the SDR to include the yuan in its composition basket, right? It wants it to be in there. And I can tell you that if they actually did succeed in doing that, it would have very little effect on, the yuan's actual usage around the world. It's mostly a symbolic move. However, this bill really goes out of its way just to stop that from happening. They argue here that the IMF should not be allowed to include the renminbi in SDRs. They also say that there should be greater IMF enforcement of IMF rules and regulations that China may be in breach of, although there's pretty much fuck all they could actually do about it. So that's more of a symbolic thing. But the SDR matter, that's like the main gist of it. And again, I don't think that really matters it kind of makes some sense in so much as the IMF is controlled by the United States. That was kind of, for those of you not familiar with the IMF and the World Bank, they were both created after World War II as part of what was called the Bretton Woods system. They were both basically major tools that were used to manage international trade. The Bretton Woods system ended up collapsing in the 1970s, but the IMF and the World Bank kind of stuck around. But my point here is that when the IMF and the World Bank were created, there was discussion between European powers and the United States about how they would be governed, like who controls them. And so they actually decided on a division of labor. The World Bank would be controlled by European appointees, and the IMF would be controlled by American appointees. So the IMF is a de facto American organization by that arrangement. So it makes sense that the IMF would kind of reflect in its policy making American foreign policy objectives. So while including the yuan in the SDR doesn't really matter in my mind, at the same time, in so much as not letting the yuan into the SDR is a minor win for the United States, it does make some sense in that way. One would expect the IMF to reflect that. So not a completely pointless bill, but it is just mostly going to be ineffectual, even if it does everything it aspires to do here. Okay, so the next one is the End Chinese Dominance of Electric Vehicles in America Act. This one, and I'll just read the quote here, bars Chinese electric vehicles with batteries sourced from prohibited foreign entities from eligibility for the Clean Vehicle Credit, as modified by the Inflation Reduction Act. So long story short, the Inflation Reduction Act was a major, landmark bill passed by the Biden administration and Democrats a couple of years ago with some Republican support. Part of the law tried to subsidize production of electric vehicles and batteries in the United States. The trouble is that the way the bill was written, Chinese producers could actually get some of those subsidies. So this basically closes that loophole. Now, the issue here is that there are very few Chinese electric vehicles sold in the United States. So while technically they did qualify for the subsidies, there were so few Chinese cars being sold here that it basically just didn't matter. And you do have to kind of make them here to qualify, make and sell them here. So banning this, closing this loophole, it is useful, it makes sense, but it's also going to have virtually no impact on the current status quo as far as electric vehicles and the market thereof. Sanctions List Harmonization Act.
These
Let me see
acts
here.
have crazy names.
Oh yeah, they did 25 of them, so there's only so much that you can't really call more than one the China bill, right? You gotta come up with some more colorful names. Let me see, what was this? Basically just requires key departments to cross-reference their sanctions lists so they're all aligned. I think that was pretty much the gist of that. Different agencies and departments in the government are responsible for maintaining different sanctions lists with regard to different bits of legislation or administrative orders, as the case may be. But they don't always coordinate their efforts such that they're all on the same page. One department may be sanctioning one thing, but then another department might not, even though technically they both should be. And that comes down to just different remits, different orders, blah, 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 that kind of thing. It's just bureaucracy, basically. So this bill says that they should make an effort, that is to say, departments and agencies of the United States government should make an effort to try to ensure that they're all on the same page, that one department is not allowing something that another department is banning. So that's useful. They should be doing that, but at the same time, a bill mandating it is not really necessary. You could very easily do that with just like an executive order of some kind. So some of this is really just grandstanding on the part of legislators here. They're trying to do something for the sake of doing it rather than substantively fixing something. There's also a notification requirement. Departments have to notify Congress when it considers placing an individual or entity on a list, but determines not to place the individual or entity on the list. you'll notice with a lot of these, especially going forward, that notification of Congress is a big thing. This is especially common in the lowest tier list, which we haven't gotten to yet. A lot of the bills passed are just stuff that pretenses to make a substantive change to the strategic balance between the United States and China, especially economically, but which really just requires that the executive branch do more reporting to the legislator, which again is kind of useful, but is mostly bullshit. A lot of this is information that they already had access to. It's just now technically the executive will be legally bound to provide it. One such example here. Okay, so the next one, Economic Espionage Prevention Act. God, what was this one? Let's see. Basically prevents marginal enhancement to the president's ability to block activity of quote-unquote adversary entities and the president's freedom of action under economic emergency powers. Yeah, so this, as I recall, I'm not going to read through the whole thing here, but basically, I don't know if you guys have heard of the Emergency Economic Powers Act, but that was a set of powers that were granted to the president in the 1970s that allowed the president of the United States to unilaterally, on their own discretion, impose certain sanctions on countries. Excuse me. In certain circumstances, I think national security circumstances are the main ones, but also there might be others, like if there's a significant economic dislocation happening because of an economic shock somewhere in the world, that could also technically activate them. So that's the gist of the emergency economic powers we're talking about here. Now, they had been kind of clipped a little bit out of, coming out of the 70s into the 80s and 90s, but now they're trying to expand them a little bit here with this bill, marginally. So it's an incremental increase in the discretion of the president to use emergency economic powers, rather, to place sanctions on states. In this case, probably China, presumably. Let's see, it also authorizes the president to impose visa and property blocking sanctions on foreign adversary entities that knowingly engage in certain activities, economic and industrial espionage, the provision of material support or services to foreign adversaries, blah, 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 or just violation of U.S. export laws. So again, marginal increase in the president's discretion here. But otherwise, it doesn't really increase the scope of his power, per se. Like, you can't use these powers to do anything you couldn't do before. You can just apply more punishment to people you could already go after for violating existing law. So kind of useful, but doesn't really change the underlying ground game here. Countering CCP Drones Act. This one is supposed to target Chinese drones, specifically by requiring the FCC to include DJI products on a special list of entities that the FCC program funds, a special list of entities that FCC program funds cannot be spent on. So basically, the FCC can't spend any of its money on DJI drones. If you don't know what DJI is, that's the leading drone manufacturer in China. A lot of the commercial drones you see around the world are manufactured by DJI, easily the leader in the industry. So here, the bill in question is basically trying to prevent government money, specifically FCC money, from ending up with DJI. And, it makes some sense, like a lot of these here in the middle tier, but it's a pretty minor barrier. It's not going to significantly crimp DJI here. Like, it's not as though FCC program money is a major driver of DJI's profits. Let's see.
We did get a note from chat, someone who said that they're passionate about the Chinese EV shift/issue. It's a legitimate, huge problem that nobody, the general pop in the U.S., seems to know about.
Well, that's a conversation unto itself. This ties into the EV issue, but the EV issue is also kind of a standalone economic issue, kind of transcending Sino-American competition.
Gotcha.
Like electric vehicles, that's an emerging product, like it's an emerging market, but it's still pretty nascent. And from what I've been reading, take up by American consumers in particular has been very grudging. So it's been very slow. I would not be surprised if we end up seeing hybrid vehicles dominate in the United States rather than just pure electric vehicles. So I don't even know that EVs are necessarily going to become the dominant form of automobile here in the US, even over the long term. That's not guaranteed to my mind. But I could be wrong. But regardless, as far as how it ties into Sino-American competition, yeah, like if American car producers are not producing any electric vehicles and electric vehicles became the main product on the market, that means the United States is going to become import dependent on automobiles, for one, and it's also going to mean the collapse of the American automotive industry, assuming they can't find alternative sources of revenue. And both of those would be pretty significant strategic defeats for the United States and its industrial base. So that is and should be a priority. But again, EVs are still pretty new. I don't know necessarily that the EVs will become dominant to the point where they could significantly undermine the established automotive powers in the United States. And even if China does take the lead on electric vehicles, you can always just tariff them to price them out. That's entirely doable. And we're already kind of starting to do that. I think the Biden administration placed new tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles just recently, which is not going to accomplish much because, again, there's not very many being sold here. But it's part of a broader effort to kind of prevent them from eventually becoming dominant in the market. So that's useful as far as not becoming dependent on imports of Chinese electric vehicles, but it's not so useful if you're, for example, interested in climate more so than Sino-American competition. Lots of environmentalists are not especially happy about it. But even beyond that, the bigger problem is going to be that if you're an automotive company in the United States and you've been dragging your ass on electric vehicle development, having tariffs blot out your main competition does nothing to incentivize it. That's the traditional problem with import substitution economic development strategies, right? You want to raise tariffs to block out foreign competition so that domestic producers can fill that gap, can dominate local domestic market share, and you can develop that industry over time. But the problem is that if there's no competition from more efficient foreign producers, what's the incentive for a domestic producer to become efficient, right? You will have domestic producers, but they have every incentive to spend money lobbying to keep the tariffs in place rather than investing in a better product that can actually compete internationally. And this is not an academic problem, right? This was a big problem across much of the developing world in the 1960s and 70s. After World War II, just about everybody and their mother tried to do import substitution as a way to develop their economies. And the vast majority of cases, they failed pretty miserably. In the case of Latin America, it was almost catastrophically, because it was specifically because governments in the region were spending so much money on a lot of these infant industries they were trying to develop under the protection of tariffs that ended up bankrupting a lot of governments in the region in the 1980s. People in the developed world maybe don't know about this or maybe don't remember it, more like. But there was a huge wave of debt defaults across Latin America in the 1980s. A lot of that had to do with interest rate hikes in the United States, but it also had to do with the huge debt that a lot of countries in the region had built up over the previous 2 decades. A lot of it, again, stemming from economic development programs. And, when the cheap money was finally cut off after interest rate hikes, they got burned really bad. There was a huge economic crisis all over Latin America through much of the 1980s. And it hit different parts of Latin America to different degrees. Some areas were able to recover faster than others. But, you look at a case like Bolivia or Peru, they actually had hyperinflation because of this. They couldn't handle it well at all. And there were a number of other regions that really struggled as well. But the idea here is that import substitution has like a clear-cut incentive problem, right? There's a moral hazard there where by protecting the industry, you're basically telling them that they don't have to compete as hard. So unless you have some kind of arrangement where you threaten them, where you say that we're going to raise tariffs in 10 years, so if you're not ready by then you can get fucked. Unless you're doing something like that, then they're just going to sit on their hands, right? By raising tariffs and international competition, you've eliminated the main incentive for them to invest in the new product. And given how shit American automotive firms have been over the past couple decades, I'm really not optimistic that they're going to really improve because of tariffs. I strongly suspect that they're just going to half-ass it like they've been doing. But who's to say? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they'll actually try for once. for the first time in a long time. Anyway, big side tangent. Again, that's the whole electric vehicle thing is a whole topic unto itself, and I'm sure there's people very knowledgeable about the technology in chat who know more about it than me, you know, who can comment on it, and I would encourage them to contribute. We would love to hear from them. Okay. Oh, actually, that was the next.
That was the next question.
No, that was the next bill.
Oh, nice.
Decoupling from Foreign Adversarial Battery Dependence Act. There you go. Targeting batteries specifically, you know, it doesn't say so here, but specifically batteries relating to electric vehicles. So, yeah, you know, this bill in particular targets what we were just talking about. So the idea here is that the Department of Homeland Security is going to be prohibited from using its funds to procure a battery produced by certain Chinese entities. A prohibition that begins October 1st, 2027. So the prohibition doesn't even begin until several years from now, assuming the bill even becomes a law in the first place. Department of Homeland Security doesn't buy a lot of batteries, I'm fairly certain, because there's already restrictions about, when it comes to national security procurement, there's restrictions on how much you can buy from foreign countries. You know, there is a domestic production requirement involved in a lot of that. So you're definitely not hurting Chinese battery makers here by cutting them off from like the low demand from Department of Homeland Security. And I don't think DHS was really using a lot of them already, unless I'm mistaken. So I don't think this really requires a lot of change on their part either. And the fact that it's certain Chinese entities is not encouraging either. You know, if you want the law to really be more impactful, in so much as a bill like this could be impactful, you would really have to make it broad-based. You would have to say DHS cannot buy any batteries from China. That would be easier. Or from, you know, a Chinese-owned firm overseas, something like that. But as is, they're just going to restrict it to certain Chinese entities, which means it's going to be a fixed list that could perhaps be updated. But Chinese producers have already proven very adept at evading American tariffs and export restrictions by creating shell companies overseas. So this is going to be an ongoing cat and mouse game, and generally that's going to favor China because they can always just create new shell companies. That's not hard. And it's always going to take time to put those new entities on the entities list such that they're sanctioned. And it takes longer to go through the bureaucratic process of adding an entity to a sanctions list than it does for somebody to create a shell company. As you can imagine, elites all over the world have been creating shell companies for a very long time, and I assure you the industry responsible is very adept and very fast when it comes to doing it. So that's a structural advantage for China. And in so much as that's the case, that fact is going to severely undermine a rule like this that is predicated on a fixed sanctions list of entities. Also, there's certain caveats, like they actually can buy Chinese batteries if there's no alternative, et cetera, et cetera. So again, like a lot of these bills we're talking about in the mid-tier list here, it makes sense. It's just not going to be impactful. It's not really going to accomplish anything. Okay, next one, Biosecure Act. I don't always remember the details of all of these because it's a long list. It's been a week or so since I've gone through it. So give me a second here. Biosecure Act. This targets Chinese biotechnology. And let me read my notes here. Prohibits federal grantees from doing business with specified biotech firms in rival states, i.e. China, with the specification that it will probably undermine impact of bill given proclivity of firms to hide their owners' origins. That's my note. Also, it has a generic reporting requirement regarding genomic data. No surprise, you know, reporting requirements don't really matter. It's not going to change anything. So whenever you see that, you can pretty safely ignore it. But prohibiting federal money from being spent on businesses that are biotech in nature and that are located in rival states, that makes sense, right? You don't want to just give money to technology firms that could give a rival a big advantage in a critical area that could be important to a future conflict, be it an economic conflict or a military conflict. You know, that said, again, like with other areas here that we've touched on, I don't know how much money the Chinese biotech sector is getting from the American government. So this isn't really a big difference maker. Makes sense, probably won't matter. That's been the mantra thus far. And again, another example. Oh God, this is dumb. The No WHO Pandemic Preparedness Treaty Without Senate Approval Act. That's a pretty self-descriptive one. Basically, there's still people that are butthurt about the World Health Organization and all the shit that happened during the pandemic. Some of that is justified. But in this case, what's going to happen is that Congress, but through this bill, is going to increase its ability to exert oversight over agreements relating to the World Health Organization. That's not a bad thing, actually. Congress should have more oversight in general over broader areas of government decision making. So I'm not opposed to it for that reason, but that's pretty much the only redeeming quality here. Because otherwise, the main modus operandi behind this bill is to prevent the American government from cooperating too closely with the WHO unless certain conditions are met. So basically, it's going to require any convention or agreement resulting from the work of the WHO intergovernmental negotiating body to be deemed treaty, thus requiring the advice and consent of a supermajority of the Senate. So, again, stems mostly from COVID and skepticism generated by the WHO trying to be impartial. A lot of people were very critical of that, but keep in mind the WHO's job is not to do the right thing, quote unquote. The WHO's job is to try to do its job without pissing off all of its contributors. And that's everybody, right? It's a global institution, the WHO. And they can't really do anything that a member state doesn't want it to do. So they have to please everybody, not just the states that are nominally trying to do the quote unquote right thing. If you want an institution that does the right thing, look towards your own government institutions, because they're probably going to more reflect that. But global institutions have to balance a lot of plates, basically. If China doesn't want to do something, the WHO can't make them do it. And if the WHO has to kind of pretend not to know something in order to appease China so that China continues to participate to whatever degree it's willing, that's a sacrifice the leadership kind of has to make. So it's an impossible position for them, right? You can't expect them to just blow up the institution because a member state doesn't want to fully cooperate. It's not their place to judge, right? It's a voluntary membership by and large. So I don't think criticism was entirely justified for that, but regardless of that, Congress will, if this bill becomes law, have the ability to potentially veto agreements with the WHO. So I approve of the expansion of oversight, even if I think it's being done for kind of goofy conspiracy theory reasons stemming from COVID. Yeah, if you want a fun anecdote about the WHO, I think this was the WHO. Somebody in chat, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it was the head of the WHO that had an exceedingly awkward conversation with a journalist, because the journalist started asking about China's reporting of the virus. This is 2020, right? Back during the height of the pandemic. And she also started asking about Taiwan. And this poor bastard, just didn't know what to say. He kind of tried to pretend that he didn't hear the question. And he couldn't, it wasn't working because, of course, she just repeated it. And so then suddenly there was a mysterious outage and the call disconnected. So, of course, she calls him again. He picks up and he says, "Oh, hey." And she said, "Oh, yeah, I think we got disconnected there." And it's like, "Oh, yeah, something happened, etc." Anyway, go on. And apparently he was hoping she would just move on. And she totally did not. She just repeated the same questions. And he eventually just had to cut the interview short, because none of that was shit he could talk about without pissing off somebody, right? He could totally deny that China wasn't cooperating. And then that pisses off people in the United States and other countries critical of China. But on the other hand, he could admit that China was not cooperating, and then he pisses off China. Either way, there's going to be consequences. And again, your job as a representative or the head of the WHO is to try to continue to maintain as much participation by member states as possible. And you can't do that by being partisan. And when journalists come asking awkward questions like that, there's no winning proposition for you. You basically have to do some kind of dumb shit. I think it would have been smarter for him to give a dumb political non-answer. American politicians are very good at that. So, you can kind of review their work on that front if you want to learn. But this guy apparently didn't know how to do that. So he kept doing these stupid gimmicks trying to get out of answering the question. It was hilarious. I loved it. It's the kind of thing you would expect out of a satire. It probably will be in a satire if one is ever made about 2020 and the pandemic years. But for now, though, just a memory. But regardless, that's an anecdote about the WHO. That's the kind of thing that aggravated people in the US, and it's one of the reasons that this particular bill, the No WHO Pandemic Preparedness Treaty Without Senate Approval Act, was passed here by the House of Representatives. Okay, so this is the last one in the meh tier list. This is the Bill to Protect Taxpayer-Funded Research from Foreign Espionage. This one is mostly designed to close a loophole, kind of like with the previous bill that closed a loophole in the Inflation Reduction Act. This one closes a loophole in the CHIPS Act. Specifically, it elaborates on the definition of, quote, malign foreign talent recruitment programs, end quote. And I found that the explanation here of this particular bill was a little cagey, so I had a hard time kind of pinning down exactly what the loophole was. But apparently, and I can just read the quote here, there was a congressional committee that had found that foreign talent recruitment programs could be used by adversaries like China to secretly recruit unwitting researchers in the US and gain access to sensitive data, end quote. So there was some kind of loophole in the CHIPS Act that meant that foreign talent recruitment programs could potentially abuse provisions of the act to gain access to US researchers and potentially sensitive data. So this bill here, just about closing that. So I approved of that aspect of it. It makes sense to close loopholes like that. But at the same time, I don't know how substantive that's going to be in the long term. So that's why it got put into the meh list instead of the upper tier list, right? The substantive list. If I knew more about the details of the loophole, maybe it would be in the substantive tier. But without knowing more, I was pretty skeptical about the merits of this one. Okay, so the dumb shit. This is the bottom tier. This one goes on a while. Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Okay, so the first one here, Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act. So long story short, Hong Kong has these pseudo consulates in the United States. They're not full-on consulates or embassies, but they kind of fulfill the same role. They're similar, and they're called Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices. And to give you an idea here, because I had no fucking idea, I had to look this up to figure out what they were. A quick list of their responsibilities include enhancing understanding of Hong Kong among opinion formers, monitoring developments that might affect Hong Kong's economic and trading interests, liaising closely with the business and commercial sectors, politicians and news media, organize events to promote Hong Kong's image, regularly meeting with counterparts and contacts in the territories under their purview, and organizing overseas visits of senior Hong Kong officials. So this is fairly standard embassy type stuff, right? It's, you know, nothing really big or dramatic. Some of these offices do have dual use mandates. There's an office in London that serves concurrently as Hong Kong's permanent mission to the International Maritime Organization. There's another one in Brussels that basically acts as the equivalent consulate between Hong Kong and the European Union. And then there's one in Geneva that represents Hong Kong in the World Trade Organization. So again, not really a change in responsibilities per se, but you know, basically Hong Kong has representation not only in individual countries, but also certain international organizations. And these offices are the way that they kind of operationalize those diplomatic connections. So what does the law do? It requires the president to just periodically determine whether these trade offices should be allowed to continue to operate in the United States. And periodically, I think it was at least once a year, certify to Congress what their decision is on that matter. And let's see, and if the president ever does decide that they should not be allowed to operate, then these offices must be terminated. They basically have 180 some days to vacate the United States. So you might think that, you know, removing Hong Kong's pseudo consulates would maybe be at least a marginal improvement, but again, it's only if the president says that they shouldn't be allowed to operate. And there's really not any reason to do that. The argument that I've heard in favor of it is that some of these consulates engage in misinformation. They support information about that is favorable to China and that is potentially inimical to the interests of the United States. But my counter argument there is that that's just normal embassy shit. Like every embassy does that. So yes, you could ban Hong Kong from having any overseas representation. Getting rid of it doesn't really matter either. Hong Kong isn't all that important to the United States at this juncture. But creating a whole ass bill specifically designed to potentially give the president explicit authority to eject these consulates, pseudo consulates anyway, most of that is just grandstanding, because getting rid of them is not going to seriously crimp information activities by this, that, or the other Chinese activity. Keep in mind, these consulates are basically just extensions of the Chinese government at this point. And you still allow China to have an embassy in the United States. So all the shit the Hong Kong pseudo-consulates are doing, the Chinese embassy is also doing. And unless you're willing to get rid of all of them together, you're not really having a big impact, just getting rid of the Hong Kong pseudo-consulates. Now, if you're like me, the thing that you thought of when you read about this was a special law that the United States used to have, which actually gave Hong Kong de facto diplomatic status as an independent state. Washington recognized Hong Kong was part of China, but because Hong Kong had so many economic trade links, as well as, links with international trade organizations and whatnot, there was a law passed that gave Hong Kong special diplomatic recognition. And what that did is it kind of exempted Hong Kong from a lot of the restrictions that were placed by American law on the People's Republic of China, right? So when Hong Kong was transferred over, those restrictions were not transitive, right? They were not transferred over to encompass Hong Kong too. So long as this law was in place, Hong Kong was exempt and it could largely continue trading with the United States as well as the rest of the world, largely as it had before the handover. Now, the maintenance of that law was kind of contingent on renewal, and generally the United States Congress predicated renewal on, at least decent behavior on the part of the Chinese government vis-a-vis Hong Kong. They wanted China to continue to preserve the nominally democratic institutions in Hong Kong. And what happened is that, 2019 and 2020 happened, right? The Hong Kong government was basically subverted and seized by the Communist Party of China. And that being the case, the United States government, as a point of leverage, threatened to remove this law, threatened not to renew it. And the Chinese government was basically non-responsive, and so Washington actually followed through on that threat. So that law is gone now. Now, the problem with that is that that law was like the main leverage the United States had vis-a-vis Hong Kong. And now that it's gone, there's really nothing else you have. Like, there's little things you can do here and there as far as sanctions, but that law in particular was like the main thing that you could bring. And now that it's gone, little things like barring these pseudo consulates from operating in the United States, they don't bring nearly as much heat onto China as the threat of removing that law did. So basically, I'm just highlighting why this law is very superficial. It's mostly just about grandstanding on the part of the politicians that designed it. Let's see that. Go ahead.
I just said,
Oh.
Cool.
So the next one here, the Taiwan Conflict Deterrence Act of 2023. So this one was especially silly to me because it doesn't actually have to do with Taiwan. It basically just requires the government to share information with Congress relating to Taiwan. It also involves provisions that sanction high-ranking CCP officials as well as some of their family members. Specifically, it gives the government the ability to sanction high-ranking CCP figures that hold positions related to Taiwan. So, for example, like the Unification Office, the Ministry of Defense, blah, 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 stuff like that. It's not a bad idea in principle, but the trouble is there's already sanctions on pretty much all of those people. So this doesn't add anything new. Again, it's a lateral move for the most part. Next one, Pacific Partnership Act. So this one nominally tries to strengthen U.S. influence in the Pacific, but it doesn't really do anything to actually accomplish that. It requires the president to periodically, quote unquote, develop and submit to Congress a strategy for Pacific Partnership and then share it with Congress. So, the strategy here that this bill tries to push to increase U.S. influence is to ask politely for the U.S. president to come up with a strategy. Not exactly forceful stuff there. It also extends certain diplomatic immunities to the Pacific Islands Forum, which is the main transnational organization, if you will, in the Pacific. It encompasses a bunch of Pacific Island nations. And nominally, it's the main organization through which they negotiate common issues and problems and coordinate to deal with those problems, but it's not that productive in the grand scheme of things. But since it is the main representative, it does make sense to engage it, but we're not really engaging it in this bill. This bill basically just gives them some superficial diplomatic niceties that they didn't previously have access to. So it's a nice superficial display. It's a nice signal, if you will, diplomatically, but I'm sure if you're a representative of a country in the Pacific Islands Forum, you would prefer something much more substantive than just a technical change here. Let's see, and then the bill also expresses that the president should consult and coordinate with allies and partners in the Pacific Islands region with respect to programs that provide assistance to the region. So basically, the president should talk to allies in the region about stuff that's important to them. Okay. That was already a thing. The president and the State Department doesn't need Congress to tell them to do that. So that's totally redundant. So in short, the bill tells the government to do what it's largely already doing, and then to share what it's already doing with Congress. Cool. I mean, I guess information sharing is nice, but again, this does not contribute like anything substantive to the pursuit of America's interest in the Pacific. So the next one is technically a House resolution, not even really a bill. It's called the Recognizing the Importance of Trilateral Cooperation among the United States, Japan, and South Korea. And I have in my notes here in all caps, just a resolution. It doesn't even bind the government to do anything. This is purely just a show vote on the part of the House of Representatives here. And again, the resolution is just very mediocre. It basically just says that the United States should engage in talks with South Korea and Japan, and specifically the governments thereof, on issues of common interest. And yeah, kind of like with the last bill, that's totally already happening. A bill is not necessary to encourage that, or a resolution, as the case may be. Okay, next one, Routers Act. And this one, as you might have inferred, targets Chinese routers and modems. Here's the thing, though, unlike some of the stuff in the other tier list, this one doesn't actually block access to any kind of government fund money. It doesn't put anybody on a sanctions list. It doesn't increase the government's power to put anybody on a sanctions list. All this bill does is require the government to commission a study. Specifically, it requires the National Telecommunications and Information Administration to conduct a study of the national security risks posed by consumer routers and modems. Okay, I guess that's useful, but the thing is, there are already a whole litany of think tanks that are invested in Sino-American competition that have probably already analyzed that issue ad nauseum. So I don't know why the government itself really needs to do this. This one really feels like busy work to me. Like somebody really wanted to be able to pass some kind of bill so that they could point to it later when they're running for re-election, so they can say, I did that, I achieved something with regard to making it harder for Chinese routers to infiltrate America's markets. And, you know, when voters hear that, they're going to have no idea about the details about the bill, which again is that it doesn't actually do anything. It's just commissioning a study. Very goofy to my mind, but that's why it's in the bottom tier here. Securing Global Telecommunications Act. So this one targets telecommunications infrastructure, no shock. This one forces the State Department to come up with a strategy that encourages, quote unquote, secure telecom infrastructure in other countries. And it also has a reporting requirement. You know, like I said before, reporting requirements don't really matter. The State Department has to report to Congress on efforts by China and Russia to advance authoritarian interests, quote unquote, and as well basically just existing and doing other things that you know that they're obviously going to do. So yeah, the main thing here is that the Department of State has to develop and submit to Congress, this is a quote, a strategy to promote the use of secure telecommunications infrastructure in countries other than the United States. And this kind of ties into the whole Huawei thing, which is kind of an old hat issue at this point as far as Sino-American competition. Huawei was a tech company, is a tech company, it still exists, that makes routers in particular, also a litany of other things, but routers is what's relevant here. And the United States government has been engaging in mild, I would characterize it, diplomatic competition with China, trying to pressure other governments not to allow the import of Chinese routing equipment, or really telecommunications equipment generally. The idea being that hypothetically, the Chinese government could be leaning on Huawei to introduce vulnerabilities into their products that Chinese intelligence services could exploit in order to surveil other governments or perhaps to engage in espionage. Now, that's all good and well. Largely, the United States government has not been very successful in that effort. But regardless, that effort is independent of what this bill is talking about. You know, the bill sounds kind of dramatic, but really all it's doing is asking for a strategy. It's not asking for the implementation of a specific strategy. It's not pressuring the government to achieve particular goals. Again, this is basically a report assignment. It's requiring the government to write a report. And there's no aspect of this bill that is binding the government to actually follow through on whatever is in that report that they eventually write.
If they don't do it, will they have to go to the principal's office?
They'll get called before a committee, and then they'll slap them on the wrists, and then the government, specifically the executive branch, will promise to totally do that at some point eventually.
Ow, my
So
wrist.
yeah, this is basically just more posturing. Again, there's nothing stopping the government from just doing this on its own, right? You don't need a bill to do a report. You know, congressional staffers are basically paid to do stuff like that. And there's a number of think tanks that do that on their own, and there's a number of agencies in the executive branch that do that on their own. So the bill here is largely redundant. Again, it's just being done for attention-seeking purposes.
More grandstanding sounds like.
Yeah, you know, the bottom tier list here has a lot of stuff like that. Let's see, how are we doing? We're getting there. We're almost done. It's the home stretch. Foreign Advisory Communications Transparency Act. So this one targets media outlets, I think specifically foreign media outlets. The trouble here is that this bill is just a reporting requirement. It doesn't obligate anybody to do anything other than report. So basically the detail is mandates the FCC to annually publish a list of entities that hold a license or other authorization granted by the FCC and have ties to specific countries. And the specified countries are, you know, no surprise, China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, Venezuela, you know, the usual suspects, basically. So here, the FCC just has to publish a list of countries. That's it. It's an annual requirement. They could do it in like 10 seconds. Really, Congress could probably do it on its own in 10 seconds, but apparently we need a bill to do this. Science and Technology Agreement Enhanced Congressional Notification Act of 2024. This one kind of made me sigh when I first read about it. I'll give you a little background here. So one of the ways that China and the United States first started improving relations way back in the 1970s, when Nixon had his trip to China and the United States was trying to kind of pry China out of the Eastern Bloc and into a new kind of pseudo-alliance with the United States. Part of that process involved the United States and China signing a science and technology agreement. And that agreement, part of the provision of that agreement is that it has to be renewed, I think, every 2 years or whatever. And there was no question of it being renewed before, you know, for decades. It was just kind of par for the course. Like, yeah, there's no reason not to renew it. It's largely a superficial agreement. There's not really that much technology exchange going on. It's mostly just about providing a little bit of money for projects of mutual interest in certain areas. And it's not even much money. But over the past couple of years, tensions with China have been increasing, and so there's been some demand by China hawks to just scrap the agreement. And, it makes some sense not to cooperate with a rival on technological development, but I would point out again that the technology being developed is not like critical. The stuff is not dual use, it's not military in nature. There's not even that much going on. It's a pretty small program. So, in so much as it's a program that doesn't really do any harm, and that helps kind of at least symbolize potential cooperation and decent relations between China and the United States, there's an argument to be made that it's worth keeping around, even if just for superficial reasons. But of course, China hawks don't think like that. They think any kind of cooperation should be target for elimination. Certainly when it comes to stuff like this. And again, we're in the shit tier list of the bills in the China Week bill list. So, as you can imagine, this one is mostly about posturing. So killing a science and technology agreement that doesn't really do anything very much fits within the remit of the kind of politics in this particular tier of the tier list. So it pretty much reads exactly like what you would expect it to read. It blocks scientific cooperation with China, and it also requires and expands somewhat congressional authority over science and technology agreements that involve China in the future. If it had expanded congressional authority and oversight over all science and technology agreements, I might have bumped it up a tier. Because like I said with the earlier relevant bill, expanding congressional oversight is not a bad thing to me. But here, in this case, they kind of ruined it by just having it just be oversight over China, which, okay, you're just going to say no to all of the agreements. It's like, it's meaningless to me. You should have just banned it outright in that case. If you were just going to expand oversight over just agreements involving China, you might as well just ban them altogether. Unless with the caveat that there's some kind of mitigating circumstance that a president points out. You could have written that into the bill to allow some wiggle room. But otherwise, this is just more posturing, because I can't imagine a circumstance in which China hawks just kind of suddenly reverse course and are suddenly okay with all science and tech agreements with China going forward. I suspect that period of Sino-American history is over, most likely permanently. Let's see, DHS restrictions on Confucius Institutes and Chinese Entities of Concern Act. So this one is possibly the dumbest, because basically this removes funding from universities that have Confucius Institutes on them. And if you don't know what a Confucius Institute is, it's an institute funded by the Chinese government that was tasked with helping provide language services, classes in which people could learn Mandarin, for example. And they also did some cultural awareness stuff, celebrations of Chinese holidays, raising awareness of certain issues. Basically just little things like that. I remember I actually had a Confucius Institute at my university way back when. I remember walking by it pretty frequently back in the day, but I never actually went inside or interacted with it at all, because I didn't really care that much at the time. So it never really occurred to me to try to do anything with it. But regardless, because it's funded by the Chinese government, there's a lot of skepticism, and some Confucius Institutes and the people who work at them have been accused of pushing quote-unquote misinformation, basically Chinese government propaganda at one time or another. So there was a big push a couple years ago to start trying to get these institutions out of American universities, because they were just seen as basically foreign propaganda outlets. And, to a degree that was true, but the bigger issue is that effort to remove them was entirely successful. There are effectively, as I understand it, 0 Confucius Institutes left on American universities. And yet, here's a bill saying that it's not allowed. We're not going to allow any government funds to universities that have these institutes that effectively are extinct in the United States.
But wouldn't that help people who are still mad about it?
It will not help them, but it might satisfy them in some boring, twisted way. I don't know. This is an example of people trying to address a problem that's already been solved. It's kind of illustrates the lag between problems and actual policy solutions in Washington. Sometimes it takes so many years that by the time you actually get around to trying to pass legislation on it, the problem has kind of resolved itself. So this is another example, but they threw it in because I guess they wanted a nice 25 number. China Week, 25 bills. 24 doesn't sound as good, I guess. So they threw this one in. Maybe it was for nostalgia. Protect America's Innovation and Economic Security from CCP Act of 2024. Yeah, this one definitely made me sigh. So this reestablishes, or would reestablish if it becomes law, the China Initiative, although now it would be renamed the CCP Initiative. So for those of you who don't remember this, this was a shit show launched by the Department of Justice, specifically under the Trump administration. I think it was like 2017, 2018. And I think the idea here was that they wanted to address the fact that one of the principal forms of Chinese espionage in the United States was the Chinese government co-opting Chinese researchers in the United States and getting them to pass on sensitive data of one kind or another regarding sensitive technologies that they were working on. So it makes sense to kind of investigate that and be aware of it and defend against it, blah, blah, blah. But the issue is that the Department of Justice and the FBI and all of the other relevant national security institutions were already doing that. They didn't need the China Initiative to try to mandate it. And the problem with mandating investigating this is that it created an incentive for specifically the Department of Justice, which was responsible for the China Initiative, to kind of go out and just harass people. It's one thing if you have evidence that somebody is engaging in espionage and you want to try to investigate them. It's another thing if the government is pressuring you to arrest people. And at that point, what's going to happen is that they're just going to find excuses to go after people. And that's effectively what happened. The China Initiative resulted in a whole litany of cases brought against people, specifically generally of Chinese descent, foreign Chinese in particular, working in American academia. Virtually none of them resulted in a conviction. It was all bullshit. There were a handful of cases that actually did result in a conviction, but in those, they did not involve charges of espionage. They involved generally charges of misrepresenting information on an immigration form, maybe overstaying a visa, technical stuff like that. But as far as I know, they never actually caught any spies with the China Initiative. And it resulted in an immense amount of criticism because it created a climate of fear amongst Chinese researchers in the United States. Because mind you, not every Chinese researcher in the United States is researching the technology that's going to lead to the next great weapon, that's going to be the war winner, the next big conflict. Like a lot of them are just doing boring shit that probably the 99.9% of people around the world have no idea about and don't care about. But because the China Initiative was going after everybody so hard, it created a real sense that Chinese researchers were not welcome in the United States. And the result is that a lot of research programs, as well as a number of people working in the private sector, ended up leaving because they got tired of putting up with the bullshit. And it got bad enough to the point where even the Department of Justice finally just admitted that the whole thing was basically just a mistake and they scrapped the program. It's actually not around anymore. And they've gone back to more traditional approaches to trying to deal with the espionage problem. And I thought that was a really positive move. So you can imagine my disappointment when I see this bill, which explicitly wants to bring back the China Initiative. Why? Why do you want to do this? It already failed once. We don't need to do it again. But that's Washington for you. It's mostly being done for superficial reasons, so it doesn't actually matter that it failed. All that matters is that we're being, quote unquote, tough on China. Those of you old enough to remember, or at least have read about, the Cold War may recognize a lot of Cold War elements in these bills, in the sense that they're kind of, to a degree, hyping a threat in order basically to benefit politicians personally. Back in the Cold War, you could very easily get votes by pretending to be tough on communism, for wanting to root out internal enemies, fifth columnists, all that kind of thing, all of which was extremely unhealthy for the American body politic. The fact that the Cold War ended was not only good for the world, it was especially good for American politics, because it finally excised this running sore in the political culture that had been used and abused by successive generations of American politicians for their own personal self-interest. Total bullshit. Fantastic that it's gone. I warned you years ago that some assholes in Washington were going to try to bring that back. And you can see the first evidence of that here. It's kind of been cropping up now and again over the past year or two, but especially in a bill like this with the China initiative, you can especially see it coming back. So hopefully the Senate does not pass a version of this bill and just lets it die. That would make me very happy, but I'm not optimistic. I suspect there's just as many China hawks in the Senate that want to posture on the issue as anybody else. So we could very well see a return of this program, and with correspondingly stupid effects on the rest of the population. Okay, almost there. Two more. Maintaining American superiority by improving Export Control Transparency Act. This tries to basically require, well, all right, it's a reporting requirement. That's all it is. It doesn't do anything. It just requires the executive branch to report to Congress on relevant matters. Specifically here, requires information be provided to Congress about each export license application, including the name of the entity submitting the application, who they are exporting to, what the decision was, and how compliance with U.S. export controls is being monitored. That's it. That's all it does. All of that information, Congress could totally get without this bill, and already is getting. Totally redundant, stupid bill. That's why it's in the shit tier list. Finally, bill to amend the Export Control Reform Act of 2018 relating to the statement of policy. Totally superficial change. All this does is revise the statement of U.S. policy regarding export controls to include, quote unquote, protecting trade secrets.
What are our trade secrets? I guess they're too secret. Can't talk about
Not
it.
really defined. It's at the discretion of the government to decide what it means. So it doesn't really mean anything. And mind you, the government already has the remit, broad-ranging remit, I would add, to implement export controls to protect just about whatever the fuck it wants for whatever reason it wants. So revising a statement of U.S. policy here doesn't really do anything. If they really wanted to expand the remit of Congress and the executive branch to implement broader export controls, they could totally pass a bill that does that. This is not that bill. That's not what they're doing here. Revising a statement isn't going to accomplish much of fucking anything. So again, another superficial change. And that's it. That's the end of the dumb tier list. We've all lost IQ points having read through it, but hopefully that illustrates what bullshit legislation looks like. And as you can see, there's a lot of it, and what good legislation looks like. Again, the count them, three bills that made the substantive tier list are examples of what decent legislation on this particular issue looks like.
For people who
So
joined
hopefully
late,
that's
what is the
some.
reminder
Sorry,
of
go
those
ahead.
three? For people who joined late, what's a reminder of the three that were on the substantive tier?
Let's see. Let me scroll back up. The Protecting American Agriculture from Foreign Adversaries Act of 2024 effectively makes the Department of Agriculture a de facto member of CFIUS. Export Control Enforcement and Enhancement Act improves burden sharing among different departments of the government as far as determining what individual cases of infringements on export controls should be acted upon, and then also puts the burden of applying for a license to get an exemption to an export control on the applicant rather than the government. Again, that was the presumption of denial for licenses. And then finally, the third one, Remote Access Security Act, basically just closed a loophole that allowed foreigners to access critical technology when they're not supposed to by accessing the technology via cloud networks located in the United States.
Gotcha.
So those are your three substantive bills. And then we had the middle tier where there was stuff done that was kind of sort of useful and made sense, but which is not going to be really impactful and is being probably done more so for political reasons. And then you have the dumb tier list, which we just finished, which is pretty much all just political posturing.
Mm-hmm.
So when politicians tell you that they're tough on China and that they want the American government to go harder for whatever reason, just try to keep in mind that probably most of the stuff that they're going to advocate for doing is just bullshit that is being done purely for political theater to try to convince you that they want to be tough on China. The amount of tangible stuff that you can do as a legislator to actually go harder on China, it's a relatively short list. There's stuff you can do, but generally it's difficult, it's not sexy, and a lot of the credit will probably end up just going to the executives since they'll be the ones who actually have to operationalize it. Actual sexy legislation in that regard, pretty rare, and it's kind of hard to run on it. Much easier just to pass a whole shit ton of legislation that doesn't really do anything, that allows you to look like you're busy. That's what I meant when I said earlier, when I said a lot of it just looks like busy work. I'm totally fighting China, guys. Believe me. Please re-elect me. So there you go. China Week, 25 bills.
Awesome. Thank you for going through those. Like we weren't expecting a whole ass tier list, but that's baller.
And again, for those of you coming late, these are bills that were passed by the House of Representatives. They have not been passed by the Senate, and therefore they're not law, at least not yet. And mind you, the Senate hasn't even gone through the reconciliation process where they pass their own version of these bills and then try to negotiate with the House to come to a common bill. So super early in this process. Probably none of these bills are going to become law until like late 2025 at the earliest.
Gotcha.
But again, the purpose of going through them is just to kind of illustrate the kind of bullshit that you're going to be seeing with regard to China over the next 10 years. There's more to come, I don't doubt it.
Cool. Well, there was one question in the chat asking if you've heard about the Moldovan election. Apparently the pro-Europe party won.
Sorry. My chair is very squeaky.
It's okay.
Yeah, I was reading about that just before we started. The referendum, I think, was last week. The actual election was last week. And they held a referendum on whether or not they should put admission into the European Union as a policy goal into the Constitution, and that very narrowly passed. But the thing is, they have a provision that requires a runoff. I think if no presidential candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, that was the case. So they had the runoff today. And the pro-Western candidate just barely scratched out a victory. Very narrow. She won like 51% of the vote, I think, in the runoff election. It was something super narrow like that. So, that's good news for the West. Mildly aggravating for Moscow, I guess. I'm still not convinced they actually care about any of this shit, but that's a whole other conversation. For Moldova, it's okay, I guess. I mean, the trouble is that the margin of victory was so small. We've talked before about how, for example, narrow victories in referendums generally just guarantee political instability because invariably huge chunks of the population are going to be upset regardless of the outcome. So there's a similar dynamic here with the election. Having a pro-Western leader elected, that's fine. But the fact that almost half the country is opposed to that means that there's no real mandate to act on that. And that it could be very easy for a future government to be elected that is dead set opposed to it, and that completely changes direction. So, I guess generally as a guy living in the West, I'm pleased by the outcome, but I also recognize, having seen countries and polities with very divided voter bases engage in referendums and elections like this, to know that probably nothing substantive is going to come out of this. There's nothing Moldova can really do without having a larger share of its population be fully on board with one or the other policy direction, pro-West or pro-Russia. As is, they're just too divided, and most likely that's going to result in deadlock over a prolonged period until some kind of structural factor changes in order to break that deadlock.
Chat's asking why people would posture regarding China. Is it just to get votes?
Yeah, reelected. When people think about American politicians, they think the president, maybe if you're kind of dialed in, Secretary of Treasury or one of those kinds of guys. But there's so many more politicians than that. There's so many more actors than that involved in American politics. And it's really hard for the guys in the lower tiers, especially if they don't have seniority or don't have some really cool chair or position to hold on to distinguish themselves and to accomplish anything that gives them something to run on when they run for re-election. If you've ever had if you've ever seen on TV or YouTube or whatever, congressional committees interviewing people, or more generally grilling people, that kind of seems like they're trying to hold powerful people accountable and trying to protect the public interest and whatnot. What's actually happening in those hearings is mugging for cameras. Because what they want to do is they want to have sound bites that they can use when they run for re-election later. The actual tangible substantive work of investigating issues and problems and allegations, that's really done behind the scenes. That's done more by congressional staffers. That's done by bureaucrats. That's done by people you don't really see much in the news, or maybe never see in the news. The politicians themselves, when you see them on TV, it's generally because they wanted to be on TV so that they could try to get their name out. Television is kind of has a distorting influence on politicians' behavior. When the cameras go away, very different people. Like, I knew a professor when I was in grad school who actually was invited to speak at a congressional hearing because he was an expert, right? He was an economist, and so they wanted him to comment on this, that, or the other. And he actually had a conversation with the committee members before the hearing. And they were all very reasonable. They were all very civil. They just had a normal conversation. They said, hey, yeah, we're going to ask about this. We're going to ask about that, blah, blah, blah. And no big deal. He was like, cool, we can talk about something of substance and maybe we can contribute something here. And then he goes before the committee, the hearing starts, the cameras start rolling, and then they're just totally different people. They just totally turn into these partisan hacks who start grilling him and start fighting with him. And they're, accusing him of being biased and trying to advocate for policies that are against the public's interest, and it's all theatrical, and it's a circus. It's a performance. And as soon as the cameras were off, when the committee hearing ended, he went back and talked with them exactly the same as before. They were just putting on an act. The whole thing is just an act. So that's the influence of cameras. But that doesn't mean that they're just bullshitting entirely. Again, they have staffers that are actually doing tangible work. They are negotiating with other politicians on legislation, right? There is substantive stuff going on. It's just not stuff getting televised, right? No politician wants that because it's not sexy. That's not going to get them reelected. Them pounding a table in front of some CEO and accusing them of being anti-American, anti-worker, of ruining the country, that plays much better with voters.
That's where you get those sound bites.
Exactly.
The people who don't follow politics get all riled up. They're like, oh my gosh, they're so American.
Yeah.
I need to vote for them.
That's the thing. So that's what I mean when I say posturing, right? They're trying to look good in front of the camera. They're trying to look good to their core constituents. They're trying to win votes by looking like they're accomplishing something. But the actual tangible work they do, like, you can't use that because it just doesn't look good. It doesn't excite people. It doesn't get out the vote. In order to do that, you've got all to do the theatrical bullshit.
Makes sense. Yeah, you said that politics is Hollywood for ugly people.
Yeah, that's the old saying. Fairly accurate, unfortunately. Yeah, if you want a real look at government policy, you really can't do, like, pretty much anything where a politician is being filmed or interviewed. Unless the interviewer is, like, some real high-level guy, like an academic or something like that. Because then politicians know that the general public does not give a flying fuck about academics. Anybody interested in academic interviews or, think tank YouTube channels, I've got some. Those are not the people who are going to win you elections, right? You need the people who are watching, like, Jersey Shore or, the local news at 9 o'clock. Those are the guys you want. And they're not interested in seminars where academics talk about issues and maybe invite a politician to come and give some words. So when they're giving talks in front of those crowds, when they're giving talks that they don't think anybody's ever going to actually sit down and watch and see, they tend to be a little more honest. There's a little more candor. Not a lot more. They still bullshit. They're still careful because they know a bad soundbite can fuck them. But they don't engage in as much theatrical posturing either. But as soon as they get in front of, like, camera at a congressional hearing, a major news interview like 60 Minutes or NBC or Fox, that's when the IQs hit the floor. That's when the circus performers come out. So if you want a real look at government public policy, I would say you're much better off reading reports The Congressional Budget Office is actually a pretty well-respected analytical body. Some individual agencies are too, but some of them are a little partisan. Get political appointees in there, so that can kind of fuck things up a little bit. Some agencies like the CIA probably do produce good material, but it's the fucking CIA, right? So they're not going to let you see any of that unless it's been declassified 50 years after the fact. You're probably not going to read like the really cool shit that the CIA writes up. So your best bet other than that is think tanks. And there's a lot of think tanks, and a lot of them are heavily biased. A lot of them are basically just fronts to try to push one particular message or policy. But there are some think tanks that actually put a lot of effort into trying to produce good research, good material that is at least nominally objective. And identifying those is hard work, and even in the ones that try to be objective, sometimes they kind of have to be subjective because they get funded from this, that, or the other guy, and they want results, as they call it. And so those guys kind of put pressure on them, and they have to produce a product of some kind. So they shut that out. You can kind of recognize it when it happens, and then you can just ignore it and focus on like the actual useful stuff that they make. So think tanks, a lot of the stuff from which actually does end up in legislation, or at least influences negotiations in Congress, certainly among staffers. That kind of stuff is a better barometer by which to evaluate what's happening in government, or at least to know what to expect anyway. Obviously, there's a lot more to negotiations over legislation and strategy than just like think tank reports. Obviously, there's personal interests and lobbying and a whole bunch of other factors as well. But you're much better served with think tank reports, and probably also good political reporting. Like Politico does really in-depth stuff. If you've got a couple extra $100 or maybe $1,000, you can subscribe to the Political Pro, and that's where they really get into the detailed stuff. But I don't have that kind of money. I don't read it, but I know of it. And it's the kind of thing that professional journalists subscribe to, so that they can get a better reading of what's going on, like who's talking to who's been where, what's been talked about, that kind of stuff. If you actually dig into the weeds of political coverage, you can find out a lot of stuff and get a much better idea of what kinds of negotiations are going on behind the scene, and what kinds of legislation and policy decisions are coming down the road. But that just takes a lot of reading and, like I said, a lot of money. Politico charges like through the fucking nose for that shit. So unless you're an institutional buyer, like unless you're a newspaper or something that has a lot of money to pay for a subscription to that, you as an individual probably will not be able to afford that. So you're kind of locked out. Politico still does decent reporting even without that, but you're not getting like all of the really detailed stuff that actually kind of forms the basis for a lot of political reporting by professional journalists.
Yeah, I just pulled up the website. It doesn't even tell you what the packages cost. It says you need to chat just with someone about what it would be.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's out of my, what would you call it? Out of my price range.
What are they doing to collect their stuff or generate their stuff? Or are they doing their own reporting and that's what they're sharing? Or are they grabbing stuff from other places and organizing it well?
All of the above. They'll aggregate from other news sources as best they can. They've got reporters on the ground who have contacts with people. And then, of course, there's politicians that purposely leak information or whatnot so that they can kind of influence outcomes. There's lots of games played in Washington in that way. So, if you know the right people, then you can get decent information, and you can aggregate and pool that information with publicly available information, and then try to draw a broader picture of what's happening. And you can get a decent idea of what's going on in that vein. It helps if you have older analysts available who have worked in Washington, because they kind of know how the game works, and they can give you an idea of precedent. They can compare what's happening now to what they've experienced, and give you a rough idea of the kind of mindset that politicians and staffers and bureaucrats and whatnot have when they're looking at a given problem. So, with that kind of framing, and with good reporting on, again, the substance of negotiations and the overarching knowing the overarching incentives politicians face, you can do a pretty good job of inferring what's going on. You may not know what the outcome will be. Obviously, outcomes can be extremely unpredictable, but you can actually follow pretty closely the on-the-ground developments as they happen. But unless you're spending money and you're reading that shit like every day and in depth, you're probably not going to be able to keep up with all of it. You're probably just going to see sort of the surface level stuff the end result of all of the background dealing and negotiations that go on. That's really what most people who follow the news see, right? By the time it's being reported on like your night evening news or whatever news outlet you follow, by the time it reaches that level, it's mostly over and done with, and you've already missed all of the fireworks that went on behind it.
Well, there's also the round after that, which is social media taking the bites and the quips out of context and posting those. So there's another layer still.
And certainly that's what a lot of media focuses on. But I'm talking about substantive action here. The circus bullshit, that's ongoing. Like, as far as circus stuff, that's 24/7 show. And a lot of political coverage does focus on that, but that's just because, one, it's easy to cover, two, it excites people, it gets clicks, and it makes them money, and then three, I guess there is no, that's the crux of it. Like, it gets clicks, and it's fun to follow. Like, people who are superficially involved in politics kind of hyperfixate on stuff like that, especially if they're newer to politics. Once you kind of learn more about politics as a game, as a system, you start to see beyond that, right? It's kind of like the Matrix, right? Once you've been in it long enough, you kind of just see through the code, and you can just kind of read it intuitively. And I'm nowhere near that level, right? I'm not experienced enough, but I know enough to be able to see through a lot of the superficial bullshit. A lot of that is just static, and you kind of just have to phase that out and ignore it. And once you look at the background game, you start seeing a lot of behavior that looks more human, more normal. It's less people and pundits shit-talking each other and hurling insults and misrepresenting statistics and data, and it's more people just pursuing fundamental underlying interests. And those generally reflect the interest of their constituents, lobbyists, the national interest. It depends. Different politicians have different priorities depending on their experience, what kinds of seats they have, what kind of committees they sit on, et cetera. Stuff like that. All of that kind of goes into determining outcomes for individual politicians and by extension, aggregate outcomes. And, like I said, you can follow all that stuff in great detail, but just the information is hard to get. It's very reading intensive. Like, I could sit like all day, every day, just reading political news, trying to infer who's doing what, who's advocating for what, who's sitting on what seat, what the schedule is for Congress, and what that implies for overarching strategy, et cetera. Like, this is the kind of stuff political journalists would do. But it's just I would have no time for anything else. And our remit on here is technically the entire planet, so it's not entirely feasible. And again, I don't have the money for like Politico Pro or any of the really cool stuff. Like, I really balked at buying, what was it recently I did? I think I did Wall Street Journal. And that was pretty cheap. It was discounted, so it was, what was it, like $30, I think, for a year. And normally it's $200 or something like that. It's very expensive, but I wanted to try it because that's like the leading source of business news in the United States. Nobody else even really does business news anymore, at least nobody that's as accessible as the Wall Street Journal. You could do Financial Times, but holy fuck, Financial Times charges so much fucking money for their subscription. If I'm reading the Financial Times, it's because I'm busting their paywall. I don't think I could ever afford to legally read their shit, just because it's so far out of my price range.
Yeah, it's an interesting trade-off of you get higher quality information, but the price point is higher. They do have to pay bills as well. And because text news, you don't have to like buy the newspaper from the kid on the street. They do need to create revenue somewhere. So a lot of these websites do have a paywall of some kind based on how valuable they perceive their information to be and also how much they invest in getting that information compared to whatever the competitors are doing. But it seems like there are some pretty fancy ass places you can get your news.
Oh, hell yeah. It's a very deep well. It goes much deeper than I think people realize. One of the things I did when I was trying to kind of hone this segment a couple of years ago is I started trying to kind of refine my news sources because I wanted better information. Because I was spending a lot of time just reading basic bitch articles and like BBC World and whatnot. And what I found is that a lot of that wasn't all that substantive, and a lot of it just didn't really matter that much. And it was actually pretty rare that they would do real, genuine analysis of the stuff they were reporting on. A lot of it was just, this is happening in X place and affecting Y people. And then that's it. There would be relatively little, if any, context added. So instead of just trying to power through as many BBC World articles as I could, I started shifting focus more to analytical outlets like think tanks. I've got a bunch of them I'm subscribed to on Twitter. I subscribe to a bunch of newsletters to websites like Politico, Wall Street Journal, etc. They have a bunch of niche newsletters that you can subscribe to that focus on specific areas, and generally they get people who are either very experienced journalists or who are outright academic experts in those fields to kind of follow those issues and comment on them. And then there's outlets like Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy Mag that kind of specialize in getting like experts and really informed people to come and comment on developments in certain specific areas, foreign policy specifically in those two cases. So by kind of shifting the media diet more in that direction, I was able to kind of focus more on analysis and then cut out the chafe. I don't necessarily need to know like about every mudslide in Latin America, however tragic they may be. Like that's not really deepening my understanding of a given country's politics, economics, society, etc. So I tried to focus on learning something new with everything I read. That was the objective. Mixed success. I'm obviously not like an expert on everything, so my program was not entirely successful, but it did at least work in discovering new sources of information that were more informationally nutritious than the stuff I had been reading. Mm. So if you really want to look around for information, you can find a lot. One way to think about it is to try to think about how journalists who write about a given topic get their information. Some of it is their own experience, some of it is stuff they learned in university, but some of it is stuff they read in books, some of it is stuff they read on Twitter, some of it is stuff that they read in reports, government statements, and a lot of that is publicly available. So you can totally get that same information. You can't be exactly like a journalist, because again, like I said earlier, some of journalism is just networking, like people getting them to comment on stuff that they know and people they know. You can get some inside information from that way. That's how you read in stories about, an anonymous person working in the administration says this and that, right? That aspect of journalism is pretty much irreplaceable. Like only journalists can really do that. I can't do that as a layman. Mm-hmm. But as far as aggregating information to analyze and describe current events and project about and forecast potential future events, a lot of what journalists do, you can do. Mm-hmm. Not all of it. Again, Political Pro, very expensive. But the other cheaper stuff you can do. And you can get a much better impression of public policy debates by doing that.
There's an overlap here with the sciences. You can conduct science by doing meta-analyses of other science that's already been done, which means you don't actually have to do the field work, the lab work, and the legwork. You have to get that information, which is usually relatively hard to obtain. Like you need the academic channels to be able to get access to all of that. But yeah, it's a similar kind of aspect of a journalist doesn't necessarily need to be a field reporter. They could be finding things online, or like you said, with networking, they could be talking to people who can grant them certain information privileges.
Yeah. So basically, long story short, assuming you have the time and maybe a little bit of money, you can improve your media diet and improve the quality of the information you consume, by which you understand politics, the economy, foreign policy, etc. And you'll be somewhat better informed by doing so and less likely to just be consuming rage bait all day, because that's most of what a lot of mainstream news media outlets focus on, because that's what gets them the most money.
Yeah. Rage bait, it affects everybody. Like even people who are educated, who you might not expect to get angry about stuff. Everybody has their buttons and everybody has some issues that they are activated about. So it's more of the human universal. And that's part of why a lot of the same silly themes get played over and over again in normal films and cinema, is that it relates to the human experience in general, not just appealing to the elites. Because if you speak in such a way that what you're talking about could be written into law, you're speaking a sort of legalese, like very professional and exacting English that almost no one uses for casual speech. So you have to kind of boil it down to, okay, for the normal person who is not a lawyer, what is going on here? And whenever you make that translation, there's a lot of room to distort the information and to put your own spin on it. And that's what the talking heads on TV are doing, is they're taking what maybe started as just a basic fact of the ground and then they're inserting their own opinion in their report of it, and they're also kind of maybe changing some of the definitions slightly depending on their perspective. So you have to think about what their bias is for sure if you're watching someone who's yelling and talking to you.
Is that it? It's already 11:23. I imagine that's a bit late for you.
Yeah, well, this is a great run. Appreciate the tier list. That's something I did not expect and was an excellent treat. Also, I'm very impressed that you've been like trying to improve your media intake for the Sunday segment. That means a lot, and that's really cool of you. So thank you, Agent Smith, for that.
Well, I benefit from it too, and I enjoy it. You know, it's better than, again, mudslide stories from one end of the day to the other. So, yeah, for my mental health as much as for the segment, let's say.
Nice. Well, it is also, I think, calming and sobering for certain viewers to hear someone who has more of a big picture take and isn't quite taken by the quip of the week that is being passed around. So it kind of broadens the perspective, and it helps me a lot because I don't read news too much. So it's a nice summary of what's happening. But as always, if we made any mistakes during the segment, give us 2 scathing YouTube comments. Appreciate that very much. Well, I have an earlier start tomorrow, so I think I will wrap it here for us, and we can maybe squeeze in some BG3 later this week if that's cool for you.
Oh, sounds awesome. Thank
Cool.
you very much.
Well, thank you, Fuzzy Code, for passing along questions, and we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.